Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone joining us from literally different parts of the world. At the last check, we had 427 people sign up for this conference from 47 countries, and the list was literally endless, going all the way from um, countries in Africa to Europe, to North America, South America, Asia, literally everywhere. So it's such a great pleasure to have you all join us for the fourth edition of the Animal Behavior and Welfare Conference in Africa. Please feel free to use the chat function to share with us where you're joining us from and all of that. We'll be going straight into the event for today, and I will be calling up our moderator. But first, I'd love to read her bio. The person who will be moderating the event for today is someone who is a lecturer at the Federal College of Education, Iwo, with interest in medicinal plants and animal welfare. She's passionate about discovery and development of novel therapeutics, focusing on cancer, diabetes, and infectious diseases. She's done some prominent work in the field of reproductive biology with particular focus on the effects of dietary supplements on reproductive health. Her work has contributed to the understanding of how natural substances can influence reproductive function in animal models. So to moderate the conference for today, please make welcome Funmilola Yaya.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sunday Agbonika, for that heartfelt and inspiring conference opening. Can you all hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. Distinguished guests, participants, and animal welfare advocates, I would like to welcome you all to the fourth Animal Behavior and Welfare Conference with the theme Freedom to Choose, Unlocking Better Welfare in Companion, Farm, and Wild Animals. Just as Dr. Sunday said, my name is Funmilola Yaya, and I'll be moderating today's conference. It's an honor to moderate this virtual conference, and also thank you for joining us today as we explore how choice and autonomy can improve animal welfare in various contexts. So before we begin, I'll be highlighting a few housekeeping rules. So please keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. You kindly use the Q&A or chat box to drop your questions. We'll address them during the Q&A segment. And also, this session is being recorded and will be made available to all registered participants. Also, please ensure your Zoom display name matches the name you signed up with, as this will be used for issuing certificate. Also, this conference is more than just a series of presentations. It's a vibrant community of learners and professionals. So we encourage all participants to be active, ask questions, share relevant experiences, and network with others via the chat box. Also, use the chat section to share relevant resources. You're welcome to share links to courses, to conferences, to events that aligns with the themes or discussions of today's conference. Also, you can connect with others through the chat box. So if you're looking for someone with specific skill set or expertise, kindly feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and connect with like-minded professionals. And lastly, you can also share collaboration opportunities via the chat box. So if you're looking or if you're working on a project or idea and also seeking collaborators, this is a great space to share your opportunities and build meaningful connections. Please feel free to share them in the chat box. I welcome you all once again. So moving on, we shall be moving on to the keynote speech. And firstly, before I call on the keynote speaker, I would like to introduce the keynote speaker. She is a biologist and psychologist who is currently a professor in the Department of Fundamental Sciences, Faculty of Animal Science and Biotechnologies, University of Agricultural Sciences and Veterinary Medicine, College Napoca, coordinator of the Human-Animal Interaction Research Lab, She is also the academic coordinator of the recently founded master's degree program in Romania, that is Ethology and Human-Animal Interaction. Her professional and research interests are humane education, interdisciplinary curricular development, applied values of human-animal interactions, evolutionary psychology, and the multidimensional study of community-oriented volunteering. She teaches animal psychology at the bachelor level and various subjects at master's level, animal cognition and consciousness, animal-assisted services, human ethology, animals in society and humane education, and self-care in animal-oriented professionals. She received a PhD in natural sciences, animal behavior from University of Zurich in 2004. She's currently one of the board members of the International Association of Human-Animal Interaction Organization, HIIO. In her teaching and research, she's promoting for many years the HIIO guidelines and standards of good practices. So presenting on agency and perceived safety in relation to animal welfare, recent approaches, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Alina Rusu. Please join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage. Professor, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for this amazing introduction. It's a really pleasure to be here. And it's my first time to participate in this conference. And thank you, Sunday, for this invitation. And I'm happy to represent Yaya. Also, other colleagues of mine are here from the board. And of course, Sunday, who is a regional representative. And I will share my screen. Please let me know if you see the presentation. And as soon as you see it, I will put it on the slide. Is it okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. I will just move you up here. So I will be talking about agency and perceived safety in relation to animal welfare, recent approaches. And here you can see a picture of my cat who might appear during the conference. I have to acknowledge her presence, working in the field of human-animal interaction. And of course, some of our students, veterinary students, but also students that are in their path of becoming ethologists, animal behaviorists. And this is a picture of the campus who has hosted the IAHIO conference in 2024. And here you can see my email address in case you would like to further on communicate. That would be fantastic. And I will introduce some concepts because that are necessary to define together agency in relation to animal welfare. And thank you, Sunday, for the proposal of this topic, because actually I am teaching this topic quite a lot in my classes. So I will very shortly introduce you to some literature studies, recent ones, most of them, that are pointing toward the understanding and definition that we are most of us probably using in our field. So we talk about cognition and consciousness in animals involving also affective states. And here we have very recent models that are focusing on behavioral indicators, psychophysiological indicators, on their biological functions, and of course, how do we put them together in relationship with animal welfare? And here, yeah, it's difficult to cover everything in 10 minutes, but I just want you to stress the most important studies that bring us to the inclusion of agency in connection to animal welfare. So we have current hypotheses on animal cognition. For example, this paper, probably you are aware of it. I can share it in the chat, all the links to the papers that I'm referring it today. All the new approaches to animal cognition. There is no one cognition. And from the perspective of the authors, this is a very recent paper published in 2020, cognition is seen as an adaptive information processing in the broadest sense, from gathering information through all the senses to making decisions and performing functionally appropriate actions, regardless of the complexity of the neural internal representations. So we already see that this definition encompasses all the possible inputs and actions that are the result of mental processes. And then we move forward to this multidimensional framework for animal consciousness that I am using a lot in my, not only in my classes, but also when we teach our students in this ethology and human-animal interaction master's degree program, but also when we collaborate with veterinarians. And this is the proposal of multidimensional model of animal consciousness was published shortly after the previous paper that I just cited, and it refers to 5 significant dimensions of variations that define the animal consciousness. We talk about perceptual richness, and here we involve all the senses, evaluate richness, emotions, affective states, and we'll see later on some definitions, e-richness, integration at time. Are animals able to perceive, time in time, various episodes, integrate them in their decision making and so on, across time, temporality, and of course, self-consciousness, self-awareness, also known as selfhood. And I highly recommend you this paper because it's a quite long one, probably like 30 pages, but it offers us an excellent view on how to compare, if we want to compare, dimensions of variation of consciousness, but not consciousness as a whole concept. So some species might be higher in terms of, have a higher level of perceptual richness than others for visual, for example, or auditory signals, communication, olfactory communications, and so on. And these all have to be taken into account when designing for example, enrichment, like physical enrichment or social enrichment for the animals that we are working with. Yeah, and then I move forward. And then from this paper, this study actually served as a base, a strong, solid base for another study that was published in 2023, which is again significant for our for this keynote speech. And the title is The Agency Domain and Behavioral Interactions, Assessing Positive Animal Welfare Using the 5-Domain Model. Now, I won't insist on the 5-Domain Model because the majority is represented by veterinarians, to my understanding, but also people that graduated biology. So you have in mind the 5-Domain Model. But this is a contemporary approach to animal welfare management, having in mind the definitions of consciousness and cognition that we already went through, and how to create opportunities to animals to have positive mental experiences, state experience, that's domain 5, okay, by addressing all of the other domains. So what we switch somehow from the needs that are very important. I mean, we complement the needs with what animals want. So agency from this perspective is defined as the capacity of individual animals to engage in voluntary, self-generated, and goal-directed behavior that they are motivated to perform. And here we can include already the concept of these positive emotions that can be inferred from the agentic experiences. But what are the components of this agency? And I'm taking the definitions from this paper that I have already mentioned. So here we have competence, when an animal is able to use tools and strategies to deal with novel and ongoing stimuli or situation. The choice, 2 or more options that allow animals to exercise the agency. And here you can see that this agentic freedom of choice aligns to the freedom to express normal behavior. The freedom model is another very known model in the field of animal welfare. Then control, when animal can consistently and predictably make choices, obtain the outcomes that are motivated to achieve, having in mind, and this is very important, that inaction is also as essential as action. Challenge, various interaction can challenge animals and encourage development of problem-solving abilities that confer intense competencies. And here we talk about that 5 variation dimension that was the selfhood that connects to Umwelt and affordances, which means to the animal's inner world. And here we talk about the perceived, how animals perceive these affordances. And they may determine their ability to develop competencies and impact how they can exercise agency. So from these, we are able to define as much as possible now in these minutes the perception of safety, because the title of my presentation was agreed with Sunday to be agency and the perception of safety in relation to animal welfare. So safety encompasses the notions of physical and psychological security, physical and psychological. So you already have in mind the dimension models, of animal welfare with the domains, okay, multidimensional model of consciousness and the definitions of cognition and consciousness. So we talk about the perceived safety, which may be more or less removed from the reality of the situation. This donkey here might perceive the situation as a safe one, but from my perspective as a human, I might think that it's not a safe situation. And we all know that feeling safe represents a central component of the mental health, including here cognition, emotions, well-being, and many other dimensions such as post-traumatic growth when we talk about rehabilitation of animals. So we know that in social species, the absence of external danger is not sufficient to feel fully safe. And there are a lot of studies regarding the benefits and the functionality of sociality, inclusion in a social group as an essential survival strategy, offering a lot of benefits to the animals. So basically, when we create environments, enrichment to our animals, to the animals that we are working or we are considering when we are planning intervention, we have to construct this sense of safety as to represent the sense of safety as being directly linked to the perception of a meaningful emotional and social presence. And this can be conspecific, so individual from the same species, and multi-species presence, including humans. And now I'm moving to my last slides because I know the time is limited, and I will ask the moderator to let me know when I'm approaching the end of my presentation. I want to conclude and to bring you to these existing networking projects. Maybe some of you from here are part of these partnership projects. One of them strongly relate to the field of positive animal welfare, and this is LIFT, and lifting farm animals' lives, laying the foundations for positive animal welfare. So in this, I'm also part of 2 working groups of this project, and there is another one called now Cause Effect EVO, analyzing the affective states of animals across species. And positive animal welfare focuses on providing animals with those agentic experience that I presented prior this slide. So with experience that elicit positive emotions. So, for example, providing animals with opportunities to choose, to control, opportunities for play, positive social interactions, agency, of course, and meaningful social engagement. And I want to present you the definition. This is my last slide, and then we can discuss a bit, or you can place your questions, comments in the chat, and I will also happily share all the links to the papers that I presented in the chat. This is a very, very recent publication and a very important one published in 2024, which is in Biology Letters, a consensus on the definition of positive animal welfare. So we have Jean-Luc Rold, which is also the coordinator of the COAST project. You can even find a webinar explaining in 15 minutes the main concepts of the paper. So positive animal welfare can be defined as the animal flourishing through the experience of predominantly positive mental states and the development of competence and resilience. Hence, PO goes beyond ensuring good physical health and the prevention and alleviation of suffering. It encompasses animals experiencing positive mental states resulting from rewarding experiences, including having choices and opportunities to actively pursue goals and achieve desired outcomes. So in this definition, actually, you get a complete idea of agency in relation to perceived safety and with the animal welfare. And this
Professor.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alina Rusu. Thank you for that enlightening presentation. So I've been able to know the agentic qualities, competence, choice, control, challenge. So we'll now take a few questions from our audience. We'll be checking the chat box for a few questions. So if you have your questions directed to Professor Alina, kindly drop it in the chat box so we can pause and take some of the questions. If we don't have any yet, Professor, I'll get back to you before the end of this conference. Thank you so much. Yes. So moving on, we'll be moving on to the next presentation shortly. Yes, and we'll move to the next presentation. So please kindly stay engaged and continue to share your questions in the chat. So let me introduce our next speaker. After graduating from Penn Vet in 2005, she was a staff veterinarian for a vertically integrated pig company, where she was responsible for overseeing health and implemented health and welfare programs. Welfare programs for a vertically integrated pig company, where she was responsible for overseeing health and implemented health and welfare programs for all stages of production. After that, she went to a pharmaceutical company, Elanco Animal Health, where she supplied technical information for Elanco customers and veterinarians with a focus on in-feed antibiotics and beta agonists. She returned to the University of Pennsylvania in 2012 as a researcher to pursue board certification in animal welfare, and has since become a diplomat in the American College of Animal Welfare. She is an assistant professor of clinical production medicine in the Department of Clinical Studies at Penn Vet's New Bolton Center. Her teaching areas include animal welfare, especially farmed animal welfare and ethics. She also teaches about swine production and medicine. Our clinical interests include using geospatial information to map poultry and swine locations, sharing information about disease status, and strategizing community approaches to disease control. Our research interests include practical aspects of food, animal welfare, such as lameness in sows and growing pigs, housing consideration for farmed animals, and practical on-farm interventions to improve welfare. Presenting on What a Pig Wants, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker for today, Dr. Meghann Pierdon. Please join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage. You're welcome, Dr. Meghann.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you, Dr. Rusu. That talk was really cool and a lot of information in a very short period of time. So those are some new papers that I have not read and will plan on doing afterwards, but hopefully also kind of mix as well with what I'm going to talk about here today. So let me see if I can make it. Come on. All right, can you see it okay? Okay,
Yes.
great. So I'm going to talk about what a pig wants, but hopefully put that in the context of allowing farmed animals to make choices. And I felt most comfortable talking about pigs, but hopefully you can think about some of the things I'm saying and see if they also apply to maybe other species that you can think about that we're farming as well. So just a little bit about my background. So you already heard in the introduction, but basically I worked a lot in production, and I then came to research a little bit later in my career, and I'm now kind of firmly entrenched in academia and teaching about animal welfare. And this is actually a picture of one of our facilities at the University of Pennsylvania, and this is one of our sows out on our piggy patio. So our research facility, I kind of work in two different areas. And so this is our research facility at the university, where we can look at different housing things, from gestating sows to farrowing, and we're able to look at different methods of housing and mixing sows to improve welfare. But this, in case people haven't been to a modern swine production facility, this is what most of our modern growing pigs, this is what the type of facility that they would live in. So you can see this is also where we do a lot of research, is on the farm. And here you can see that pigs are socially housed, so they're in groups, but they're in kind of a barren environment in that they're on slatted concrete floors, and they don't typically have access to anything like bedding or things like that. So obviously meeting their needs for food and water slaughter, and they're not housed individually, but there's not a lot else going on in their environment. So we do research trying to look at these environments and see if we can make sort of practical improvements. And then on the left-hand side, there's a little bit of contrast. This is an organic facility that would meet the USDA organic standard. And so you can see these pigs have a much more space, more square footage. They have access to bedding. So this is maybe 3% to 5% of the US production compared to the more intensive type of housing that you see on the far right. So my objectives today are, first I'll talk a little bit about whether pigs want choices, and then I'll try to go into a little bit of how do we give pigs what they want and give them the ability to make those choices. So I thought I'd start off with pig intelligence. So I think a lot of us here, pigs are smart, pigs are smarter than dogs. But then when you work with pigs and you come in one day and you find a pig with its head stuck under a feed station, you wonder, how smart are pigs? But it turns out they're actually pretty smart. So in this case, they looked at pigs could look in a mirror that was placed in front of them, and they could go to a food source that was placed behind them instead of looking behind the mirror. So this kind of object permanence and being able to understand what the mirror is actually showing them is not something that all animals can do, but pigs can. There's also a more recent example of a warty pig that was using sticks as tools to be able to dig a nest. And so we also have examples of pigs and tool use. And then this one is kind of interesting. Now, not all pigs could do this, but this is visual perspective taking, where pigs could follow a knowledgeable pig to a food source. So understanding that that pig knew where food was and then follow that pig to that food source. So maybe only 25% of the pigs could do this, but still, this is a skill that you could imagine might be useful in the wild, right? If you're following a knowledgeable skill or a knowledgeable pig to a food source, and you're totally dependent on that type of foraging behavior. So I think another thing that's important to think about is, do pigs make choices when they're in a more natural environment? And so many of us are probably familiar with the pig park and Stolba and Woodgush, and looking at this kind of diversity of activities that pigs would do in a natural environment. And you can see pigs spend a lot of their time grazing, locomoting, and really engaged in these sort of species typical foraging behaviors. And so we can see when they're in a more extensive environment that they are making choices to be able to go and do all of these different things. And we contrast that with what choices they can make in a modern pig farm. And so you see that that portion of time that in the semi-natural environment, they're spending locomoting and foraging and doing all of those things. In our typical commercial facilities, like the one that I showed the picture of, really mostly what pigs are doing is lying inactive. And so, some might say, oh, well, that's because they're content. But really, it is a fact of the environment that we haven't really given them the choices, the options to do the things that they would do in a more natural environment. And so one thing I think that's important to think about is space. Space, especially here in the United States, where everything is kind of about efficiency and productivity, space is really important. But if we don't have enough space, we can't really give animals choices, right? We can't really give animals enrichment. We can't really give them a complicated environment. And when we look at some of these things like the formulas, what we're looking at is really how much do we have to decrease space to keep them from growing as fast, right? And, it turns out we have to really restrict their space to be able to restrict their growth. And so oftentimes we are not even giving animals very much space to be able to make these choices. And it affects their mental well-being as well. So here we have some information that shows us that when you have lower square footage, these animals are also going to have higher levels of glucocorticoids, and they're also going to have more lesions or injury scores. So we have this kind of complicated relationship with space. It's one of those things that's hard to convince people to give more space, but it is absolutely integral to be able to give animals enrichment, to be able to give animals choices. And here you can see this is really also for the National Research Council, the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals. So this isn't just in farmed animals, right? When we think about animals, this idea of space is important across all of the areas that we kind of have animals contained for human purposes. And you can see in the guide, you probably didn't do all the math, but basically that amount of square footage that they indicate that we should give animals is more probably than what we give in a production setting, but it is still not a large amount of space. So I'm going to cover a little bit about enrichment, and I thought I would start by talking about whether or not animals want enrichment. And so one thing that we probably all need to be familiar with is cognitive bias, and probably most people are, but essentially it allows us to train animals to a positive cue and a negative cue, and then see how they respond to an ambiguous cue. And if they treat that ambiguous cue as something good, then we assume that they're in a more positive emotional state. So this is just a little video here. Hopefully it'll show. This is one of our sows. So we've done some of this cognitive bias work at our facility. So that's her being trained to the positive stimulus. This is her being trained to the negative. So she learns. So over the course of the training sessions, she learns that that negative stimulus is not something that she should go to. And then eventually we present them with an ambiguous cue, and we try to determine whether or not they go to that ambiguous cue. So this is just a little bit of research looking at guilts. Now, this isn't in our facility, but this is a really interesting study, and I know it takes a little while to process all of these graphs. But the thing that's really interesting about it is the sort of changes in cognitive bias that happen in these animals. So we have these guilts who were originally in a barren environment, and then they're given an enriched environment, and they respond positively. Their cognitive bias changes to a more positive state when they're given that enriched environment. But I think probably the most interesting thing about this study is that the animals that had an enriched environment and then were moved into a barren environment had a more negative decrease in their emotional well-being, in their cognitive bias scores when they were moved from an enriched environment into a barren environment. So just showing that not only do animals respond positively when they're moved into an enriched environment, but that when that enrichment is taken away, that has an extreme impact on their emotional well-being as well. And so some of the things that pigs love, straw bedding. There's a lot of things about straw bedding that we've seen in the literature, and pigs can use it for multiple things. So that's one of the reasons that it's such a great environmental enrichment. They can use it for comfort. They prefer it relative to concrete floors. We do see some improvements in foot lesions in some studies, although that relationship is somewhat debatable, but then it also provides for behavioral needs where they can explore and manipulate their environment, which is pretty hard in a concrete environment. But one of the reasons that we don't often give straw bedding is that, especially in our facilities, the manure containment is underneath of the farm, and the straw gets down into that manure containment, and then we can't pump out the manure using the tools that we usually use. And so most farmers in the US, unless they're meeting the organic standard or some other higher welfare standard, are not providing straw, and it would be challenging them to do it because the environments that we're working with are pretty hard to figure out how to apply this type of enrichment. And so we know some about straw, and our sows here are in straw, and so we have looked at this, but it is not something that is sort of commonly applied, and it's probably not a practical thing to start with if we're trying to give pigs choices. We've also looked a little bit about whether pigs like other substrates, and we actually tried looking at straw and sand, and we didn't really see any difference between the straw and the sand in terms of where the pigs wanted to lay down. Then there are some other studies looking at it, and straw doesn't always win, but pigs like things that are manipulable that they can sort of use as a foraging material. And so we've looked at some other point enrichment, and I know a lot of times point enrichment kind of gets a bad rap, right? People are like, well, it doesn't really change, but hey, look, it gives them some choices, some things to interact with. And I think you can also see these sows at the top are both interacting with this enrichment. So I think sometimes environmental enrichment also provides another extra social dynamic to the environment as well. So this was a study where we went to a sow facility, a 5,000 sow facility here in northern Pennsylvania, and we gave them different types of enrichment. And as with many studies, it seems that the cotton rope is one of the things that the sows preferred the most compared to some of the other less manipulable, less destructible types of materials that we could provide them. And I'll show some more evidence about rope. It seems to have kind of a long lasting, it doesn't lose its novelty, right? Like the animals still continue to interact with it over a prolonged period of time. So these are the things that we looked at in that study. And again, it seems that the rope, and also we kind of combined the rope with that red, it's called a bite right. It's commercially available here from a lot of different farm supply places. And we could put the rope through that red thing and like hang it up really high. And then as the pigs ate the rope, we could move it down. And so it was kind of practical also for the farm to be able to give that option to the pigs. We also looked, Dr. Smith and I also looked at this with growing pigs. And so you can, for that study, we gave a lot of different types of enrichment and tried to look at, first of all, whether there was any benefit to providing the enrichment in these growing pigs, but also what types of objects they preferred. And one thing we found was that it did decrease lesion scores. So when we're trying to look for win-wins, you know, maybe decreasing aggression is one of those things that could be double good for us and for the farmer. And so you can see with all the different objects that many of them did decrease the number of lesions. And then this graph, I didn't show all of the different enrichment objects, but we could see that a lot of the, especially when we compare the chain, so a lot of farmers, if they're going to give enrichment, they'll put a chain out, which you know, is kind of not the most manipulable or destructible, but it is not, it has very low maintenance for the farmer, right? And so we see that a lot. And so we use that as our comparator. And you can see that the rope was interacted with more by a larger percentage of the pigs in the pen. And you can also see that the rope kind of goes like up and down, up and down, up and down. That's because we replaced the rope every other time that we were there. And so you can see that when we provided fresh rope, it sort of renewed that interest in the enrichment objects. At our facility, we also have outdoor access. There's not a lot of information out there about the preference for outdoor access. And actually, we've started measuring who goes outside and how often they go outside. We did a smaller version of that project, and about 60% of the sows over the course of the 10-week summer did end up going outside during one of the time periods where we were visualizing and counting who was out there. And it also seems like they like to go out there in the morning more so, where they can go out and they can, the temperature is cooler. So I think it has a lot to do with that. We also see a lot of times that sows go out there to kind of escape from other sows or from sort of social conflict. So it does make you wonder a little bit, is it really the outdoor area that they're seeking, or is it something to do with more of a social aspect of their environment? So these sows here, they hadn't been outside in a while. We had a tour, so people were coming through and we opened the doors and they were all pretty excited to go outside and hang out in the rain. I especially like the one in the middle who is trying to eat all the rain. So it certainly appears that they are appreciating their access to the outdoor environment. And so here's just a little bit about kind of when we saw the animals outside and what percentage of the herd were observed out there. So social housing is another thing that a lot of times gets kind of put out there as, oh, we're enriching them because they have social housing. And it does really add a lot of complexity and probably a lot of choices to the environment, especially when they're in these larger groups. But it's really hard to measure how much sows appreciate, or other animals appreciate, this type of social housing. So when they looked at motivation testing in sows to test how hard they would work to get into a pen with 2 other sows, only half of them worked as hard as they would to get the last portion of their daily feed. So this is but when you think about it, we chose those 2 sows, right? You know, maybe those aren't really the sows she would have chosen. And that's just one of the few complicating factors of trying to understand the value of social housing to these animals in these settings. When we looked at growing pigs that were trained to a panel pressing task, the demand curve was elastic for opening the door to go in with other pigs. So again, not huge evidence that they're really looking to go in there. But again, if they don't know who's in there and there's some uncertainty, maybe they don't feel safe enough to go and access that type of social housing. So we do know, however, that when animals are not socially housed, we see things like with social isolation in neonates can decrease immune function. It can increase cortisol. And so we were thinking about, okay, maybe we need better measurements. And we wondered, do sows create social networks? And so this is a giant heat map, okay? We looked at sows like 5 days a week for like 2 years. And the first thing I'll say for those of you like me who are not able to generate this type of statistics is that this is not a pattern that would be generated by chance, okay? And what we're really seeing is that these sows do tend to form social networks. And when we dig in, we find that they form these networks with the animals that have been with them through consecutive breeding groups. So essentially, they do have preferred partners that they will interact with, that they will associate with, that they will sleep with more than with other pigs in that same group. And we can also do things to facilitate those social networks. So this was another study where we looked at mixing the sows together at breeding and then seeing if when they went in with the big group, if it made any difference that they had been mixed together. And we did see lower lesion scores in those pigs that were pre-mixed together. So there's kind of a little indication there that maybe we can help form those subgroups so that then when they get into that pen, they already have a group of preferred partners, right? So like if you go to summer camp and you already have a friend, it's kind of nice, right? And that's kind of what we can think about trying to do for these sows, where maybe we can facilitate this group formation, decrease sort of aggression, and promote social cohesion in these animals. The other thing we can think about is complexity, right? And so if we think about complex housing, this is a pretty old study from Fraser where they looked at a 2-tiered pen, and this was in growing pigs. And this type of housing, you can imagine, could generate these different spaces, these different hiding areas, and these different microenvironments, which takes up the actual same amount of space in the facility, right? A lot of times in pig facilities, we don't use that sort of upper space. And so maybe we can provide environments like this where pigs have options to utilize these different areas and different aspects of their environments. In sow housing, we think about partitions, and sometimes these partitions have been shown to decrease aggression. The way we think about it is if you're being chased along by somebody, maybe you can duck in here and, you know, be out of the way and not be subject to as much aggression. And we also see when we looked at our social networks, this was one of the ways we categorized the networks, was by looking within the partitions in the facility. And so we think that also these subgroups, there's social cohesion that goes on where they will choose to be in these different laying areas near the same cohort over and over and over. And even when you work in these facilities, this is actually helpful, right? Because if you work in these pens and you're trying to find somebody who lost their ear tag, if you work in these pens every day, you probably know where that sow typically will be found. And same thing when we're trying to work in these pens and do vaccinations and things like that. If we know where those animals are going to be located, we can actually use that to help our workers, as well as giving our pigs choices. We've also found that some of the more dominant animals, the animals who eat earlier in the day, tend to lay closer to the feed station. So maybe not huge ground earth breaking, shattering type of information. But again, it gives these animals a choice to kind of decide where in their environment they're going to sleep, to be able to take advantage of those limited resources. And I think when we're thinking about this, a lot of times we wonder about if the ability to give animals choices, and maybe more complicated choices where they can actually have some agency and some control over their environment. And you saw the environments that we're working with. And so sometimes we have to think a little bit harder about how we might be able to give these animals some control and some influence over what they can do and what they can control within their environment. And so one of the things we can think about is complexity and contra freeloading. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with contra freeloading, where an animal will work for food despite the ready availability of that same food. And you could think about how in the wild that this would be adaptive, such that animals could gain sort of useful information for future foraging by doing more work even when food is readily available, by exploring and understanding their environment. And this was just a little study looking at contra freeloading in pigs. And basically what they found, apparently pigs really like chocolate covered raisins. So in our facility, we usually give them stale cookies, but in this experiment, they used chocolate covered raisins. And what they found was that the pigs would spend more time in the pen where the chocolate covered raisins were distributed out in the straw bedding than they would in the pen where the raisins were just in a trough, sort of freely available. So thinking about that, you can see that the pigs preferred to be able to spend more time sort of foraging and getting that, you know, positive reward for their goal-directed behavior than to just consume that product easily right out of the trough where it was presented to them. Here's another one looking at thermal preference in pigs. So I just think this one's really interesting. Again, it's not new, but this study, they looked at weaned pigs. So they've been weaned from their moms. They're in a nursery facility. And essentially, they trained the piglets and gave them the ability to change the temperature of their environment. Okay, so that's a pretty cool choice. And they let these pigs determine by pushing a button what temperature they wanted to change the environment to, and at different times of day. So you can see a little bit from this chart how the preferred temperature went down over the course of the study window. So as the pigs got bigger, they preferred a little bit cooler temperature. And then they also showed that at night, when the piglets would all be sleeping together, they actually decreased the temperature of their environment. And so overall, the pigs changed the temperature to be lower. And you could imagine this would generate an energy saving for the farmer as well. So I just think this is a really cool example, because when you think about things where we might be able to get farmers to buy in, where pigs would change to use less energy, less electricity, less heating fuel, you know, this could be something where they also have an economic benefit to the farmer as well. So just a really kind of cool thing to think about that would benefit both the pigs and the farmers. Another thing we can think about is cognitive enrichment. And there's some studies out there looking at using acoustic cues to train sows to use a feed station, and that it increased the amount of time sows spent locomoting, decreased vice behaviors, and sort of decreased reactivity. I think it's not been studied, but when we get sows into our facilities where we use electronic sow feeding stations, animals have to learn, first of all, how to use the feed station, that it's providing feed, those types of things. But they also then have to navigate a complicated social hierarchy. So when we use electronic sow feeding stations, each sow has an RFID tag in her ear. She goes in, it knows who she is, how much feed she's supposed to get. So she has to learn all those complex things. She has to go into an environment that she's really not used to. It makes weird sounds. But then we also don't see sows like standing there all day long waiting to go into the feed station. So they also learn who is around them, who eats first, who eats second, when do they eat, when's their time in the order. And they also have to kind of use their thinking and thought processes to figure out this whole complicated social environment as well. And so I think of that as cognitive enrichment as well. So what final thing I really wanted to talk about a little bit, and then I'll open it up for questions, is about the benefits. So we think more today about one welfare, about animal welfare and human well-being, and how those things interact. And while I think there's certainly a lot of instances where, you know, welfare maybe is only important to the pig, right? Maybe we don't get an economic benefit from providing them with a more enriched environment, but there certainly may be places where there's a crossover between providing sort of choices and agency and improved environments for animals and human well-being, and some of these other things that we sort of categorize under the one welfare umbrella. So some of the things that's actually out there in the literature that we've shown these benefits exist were that animals in an enriched environment were easier to move from one place to another. And maybe this sounds not that important, but in pig farming, we're forever moving animals around. So this is just an example of a sow moving from farrowing, where she was just weaned, up to the breeding area. And so people, caretakers on farms, spend a lot of time trying to get pigs to move from one place to another. And so if enrichment and an enriched environment could make this easier for everyone, it would be a benefit to both the workers and to the pigs. Some other benefits, I'm not sure how this how this helps farmers. Maybe it would help, this would be cool to understand, is maybe enriched environments would help us train you know, sows to the electronic sow feeding stations, for example, because this research, they showed that animals that were in an enriched environment showed improved cognitive performance in a spatial learning task. And so you might be able to imagine where if animals are in a more enriched environment, some of these, you know, training gilts to use a sow feeding station is kind of frustrating work. It's not glorious. It takes a long time to convince them that it's not bad. A bad thing to do to go in there to eat. But if you think about maybe some of these, maybe enrichment could improve their ability to learn more quickly. Another study showed that pigs in an enriched environment had decreased feed wastage. And this is a big deal because obviously our biggest cost when raising a growing pig is feed. And so you could imagine that if animals have some other substrate to root in, that is not feed, that maybe we would see less feed wastage, less sort of rooting around in that feed and removing that from the feeder and wasting it. And so you could also tie this back in as well to an environmental impact. So this is one where if you could really demonstrate it and find a practical way to do it, that you could definitely get farmers' attention, especially here in the US. And then the final thing I think about is really sort of how much fun it is, okay? So these are some silly pictures, but you can see our sow there on the right. We had, during one summer when we had a bunch of summer students and researchers and everyone out there, we had a pool party for our sows. So we went and got disposable pools, and you can see the pigs are out there, they're in the pools. The thing you can't see are the people, okay? Like the students, everybody is super excited. Everybody is really enjoying watching the sows. Now, the sows destroyed these plastic pools in about, I don't know, 15 minutes or less. So it's maybe not the most prolonged, but to me, it really just demonstrated the power of allowing people who work with these animals, who work in these facilities day in and day out, who have to do hard things, okay? We scrape poop, we castrate piglets, we have to do things the animals don't like give them vaccines. And so all day we're doing all of these things that, you know, maybe we know how they improve the animals' lives by keeping them from getting sick or things like that, but for once, when we give enrichment, we get to do something nice. Like we get to do something that provides something nice and positive for those animals. And I just put the picture of the pumpkins up there because we also do a lab with the veterinary students where they get to come in and sort of measure the welfare impact of enrichment. And it's really a miniature study of behavior in like an hour, but we give them pumpkins to give to the pigs. And it's just another example of, first of all, the pigs love the pumpkins. Okay. I should put a better picture in here of a sow with a pumpkin on her face running around, but the students really love it as well. Right. And so again, just this idea that there's something to this idea that if workers and caretakers and farmers can be able to provide these choices, provide enrichment for their animals, that is not just a one-way street where we're improving the lives of the animals, but there's an impact to the farmers as well. And I see it too when I work with farmers who are kind of doing meeting the organic standard or a higher welfare standard. They're really interested in the pigs and the husbandry and what you know, will make the lives of those pigs better. And there's even some research out there to show that farmers who kind of work in these more extensive environments have like higher happiness scores. And so I think there's work to be done for us to figure out, you know, what is this relationship between the worker and enrichment and the animals? And is there a pragmatic way to be able to apply this, especially in a commercial setting where, you know, financial margins are really slim. But to me, this might be another good way where we find a win-win, you know, where we can kind of incentivize farmers to be able to apply these concepts in their environment and actually get something in return for that. And so with that, that's what I have for my talk today. And I will leave it up to the moderators. I tried to stay on time here, so I think we do have a few extra minutes to see if there's any questions that I can answer.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Meghann Pierdon, for that insightful and thought-provoking presentation. So we will now take a few questions from our audience. The first question is from Innocent Iwagu. Dr. Meghann, he asked that slated versus concrete versus trough floors, outdoor access, social housing, provision of other needs, what is the best combination of these factors for optimal production?
I actually don't think we found the optimal sort of mixture in a commercial environment, especially here. Now, I don't, you know, a lot of other countries like in the EU, they probably have more solid flooring, more bedding. But for us here in the US, we basically, our sows were always housed in stalls 2 foot by 7 foot. I say always, you know, the last 60, 70 years. And then we took those animals, we took them out of those stalls and we put them on the exact same floor. And I don't think that we have found the appropriate flooring that will really sort of maximize the welfare of those animals, but also allow for the provision of any type of bedding. So I wish that a smart ag engineer would come up with a really great flooring. The main impact we see of this type of flooring is lameness. So we see a lot more lameness in these sows that are on that type of flooring. When I've looked at growing pigs in an organic farm type environment where they have deep bedding and solid floors, we hardly see any lameness, and similar with sows that are in that type of environment. And so we see this like environment where we know that solid floor with the deep bedding seems to actually really be good for sow foot health, but it's really not compatible with the current sort of more intensive types of housing that we have. So I wish I knew. If someone has an idea, let me know.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Meghann. We also have another question here from Akiyemi Rukoyat. She asked that she understands that the straw bedding may be more comfortable for the pigs compared to the concrete floor, but in terms of years on cleaning to ensure good environmental hygiene, which is better, the straw or the concrete?
Yeah, so I think that the straw is really a challenge when cleaning. And what I see in the sows is that we have to take a lot of energy to keep the straw bedded areas clean. And the slatted concrete is definitely cleaner. And even in sort of our commercial facilities, what I see when I go out to the organic farms is that it's all about management. Some farmers have a beautiful, and I'm sure they're the ones who spend more time. They have beautiful bedding. They clean it out and put in new bedding, or they have a really good sort of strategy for adding more bedding. And then I go to other facilities with bedding and it's not really very pleasant. It's very deep. And your feet get stuck in it, and the pigs don't honestly seem that worked up about it, but maybe you even noticed in my picture of the organic farm, even that one, they have really nice bedding, really good bedding management, and the pigs are still kind of dirty. So sometimes I think, and I've seen US farmers, when they see that, they're like, oh my goodness, that is disgusting, I could never do that. But I think if we ask the pig which one they would prefer, I think that cleanliness might be lower down on their list than it is on our list as farmers. And that's not without good reason. You know, there's reasons we want a clean environment for health and things like that. But it's definitely cleaner in the fully slatted facilities, as a short answer.
Okay, thank you for that beautiful answer. Also, Doctor, we have a question. What do you suggest as the best combination of these factors for optimal production? From Professor Innocent.
Yeah, so in terms of optimal production, we don't often see a strong production benefit of providing choices. One thing that when I think about things like our electronic sow feeding stations and those technologies, we do see a benefit, and that is decreased feed wastage. So the other types of feeding that people do in these big pens, where they're putting feed in a trough for the sows, and the sows are eating it as fast as they can, they tend to have to feed more in those facilities to be able to keep the sows from fighting and keep good body condition. Whereas when we have this type of technology with the sow feeding stations, we can feed her a very structured amount. She's in an enclosed environment and she eats all of that and she ingests all of that. And so then, you know, we're saving money on feed. And that is actually, you know, maybe one of the few places where we see sort of a production or economic incentive toward these maybe more complex environments. A lot of times a more complex environment, the way that we get incentivized is through the market, right? So they'll pay us more because we made a more complex environment, because we meet these different welfare standards. And so When we think about production, it can get a little bit more complicated because I might be getting paid a lot more for my pig, but I just may not make as many pigs. They may not grow as fast as somebody who is truly trying to make the most, pork for their investment. And so it kind of depends a little bit on what you're getting incentivized to do as well from a market perspective.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We also have another question. Talking about pigs' intelligence, is there a reason as to why the presence of one pig eaten stimulates the other to eat as well?
Well, at least in our sow environments, our sows are hungry. Okay, so our sows are fed, probably on average 4 pounds a day. What's that, like 2 kilograms? And they would rather eat maybe 3 times that if they had a more fibrous diet. And so our pigs, at least in our environments, are going to eat when everyone else is eating, A, because they're hungry, and B, because it's a limited resource. I think if you think about pig behavior in the wild and how pigs kind of forage, and sounders are small groups of, females that kind of move around together, it's probably natural as well for those animals to kind of all eat together at the same time with their small cohort of other animals in their little group. So, I think there's multiple components to it, but I think in our commercial environments, it's very much because we have created an environment where they're hungry and they want to eat as much as they can eat whenever they can eat it. We have also selected a pig to live in that environment that's very, very food motivated and wants to eat all the time. And that's because we want them to eat all the time so they grow fast. And so we have created these animals that are just really hungry, and we're selected genetically to be really hungry as well.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So we also have a brief conference question for you. What is the best way to educate farmers that animals are sentient beings and therefore need to be taken care of even as they work on the farm? That's the first one. The second one is, what is the best advice to farmers that use animals for farming, e.g. oxen used to plow fields to safeguard the welfare of these animals? And lastly, would you advise for a total ban on the use of animals for work? This question is from Tapi Walundu from Zambia.
All right, so in terms of educating farmers on animals being sentient, I think we have to give them a little bit of credit that I think most of them understand that animals are sentient. But part of the hard part is that we then also ask them to do things that are probably aversive to those animals. And so that's a pretty big challenge for those farmers. And the more you sort of push on, well, these animals are sentient and they, deserve all of these things, and you're basically telling them that they're being bad people by doing the things that they are supposed to do on a day-to-day basis to achieve productivity, to meet the rules for marketing their pigs, all of those things. And also that, we're keeping them in these kind of barren environments. And so to me, we kind of have to improve the whole system at once, I think, and give farmers more opportunities. I really wish we would add sort of just baseline positive things into our quality assurance schemes, for people to see like, well, if I do this, actually I'm kind of meeting the challenge of doing more for these animals. And so I think we need to do it as an industry versus just kind of telling farmers like, these animals are sentient, why are you doing all these mean things to them? I don't think that's going to really help us make any sort of progress. In terms of working animals, I don't have a lot of experience in terms of using animals for work. I mean, I live in an area where a lot of people use horses and mules, especially for work. And I think, as a veterinarian, I wish there was more access to healthcare and to education for those groups. I mean, I know they do a lot of their own. And so I wish there was just a stronger connection maybe between the veterinary community and some of those working animals. And, I think it's a hard thing to say that we should ban animals for use in work. I think there could be something very symbiotic about using animals and people using those animals, provided that, they all have a good life, that, that seems more important than thinking about banning, the use of animals in farming. So I don't know if that's.
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, due to time, we'll be taking the last question from a participant that also runs a pig farm. He said he had an unusual experience. He said one day he introduced a new sow into a stall with another sow. Within a few minutes, the new sow suddenly died. Could this be related to stress-induced conditions such as high blood pressure in pigs?
Yeah, it can. More often we see sort of catastrophic injury, right? Like a broken arm, or we've seen broken jaws because they fight with their heads, So we've seen that from fighting. But the other thing to consider in pigs is that especially if they eat a lot very fast, they can get a twisted gut. And so that can happen very, very quickly. And I could imagine where you might put two animals together. Now the feed becomes, instead of a resource that they could kind of eat whenever they want, they got to eat it all at once. And you might have some sort of gastrointestinal challenge like that. And to me, that would be probably more likely than something like a stress and typically when sows or other pigs get stressed, that is a very prolonged process. Like we see it and it can take several hours for that stress to either resolve or result in some other outcome. So I would guess gut twist, but that's just a guess. But you could see where that could happen when newly mixed animals put together.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Meghann Pierdon. That'll be all for now. So if you have more questions for Dr. Meghann Pierdon, you can reach out to her and you can drop your messages and your questions on the chat box. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Meghann.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we'll now move on to our next presentation. Please kindly stay engaged and continue to share your questions in the chat. So let me introduce our next speaker. She helps people create choice-rich environments that help pets live in greater harmony with humans and make the entire household happier. She is faculty at both Victoria Stitwell Dog Training Academy and Fenzi Dog Sport Academy, on the board of directors of the IAABC Foundation, a member of the advisory board for Pets for Vet, Chair Emeritus of the Education Committee of the Association of Professional Dog Trainers, APDT, and a former CCPDT board member. She also volunteers for National English Shepherd Rescue. She's a sought-after presenter, and her writing has been published many times, including her book, Your Puppy and You, a step-by-step guide to raising a freaking awesome dog. Along with Dr. Christina Spalding, Irith co-founded and is faculty at Carefree Companion, a program that helps people teach greater stress resilience and better emotional regulation to their non-animal companions. Irith's company, The Sophisticated Dog, LLC, offers online services to pet training clients and fellow pet professionals worldwide, presenting on choice in real life, providing agencies safely and appropriately. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker of today, Irith Bloom. Please join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage. You're welcome, Irith Bloom.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the amazing people who have put this together, especially Dr. Sunday. Thank you for having me back. And I've really enjoyed the other presentations. You're going to see that some of the things I talk about are going to overlap with some of the topics that have already come up from Dr. Rusu and Dr. Pierdon. And I'm sure that some of what Dr. Dreschel says is also going to be relevant. I'm not going to be delving as deeply into some of the topics they delved into. I think it's going to be really nice how our various talks fit together. So I'm going to be talking about choice in real life. I do personally focus on companion animals rather than farmed animals, but some of what I discuss, I will try to reflect back into how we can use it in a more production sort of setup. And we're going to talk about providing agency safely and appropriately. So we'll talk about what choice is and why it matters, which you got a little bit of a preview of that with Dr. Rusu, and I will not go into it as deeply. We're going to talk about practical considerations for providing choice, and then we're going to talk about different ways to add choice. Now, I do want to say, following up on the 5 domains discussion that Dr. Rusu so wonderfully shared with us, that this presentation is assuming that basic needs are already being met. What I mean by that is that I am assuming that the animals are being fed appropriately, that they have appropriate shelter, and that at least their physical safety is being addressed. So whether they have a sense of safety, that's a separate issue, as Dr. Rusu pointed out so well. But I want to make sure that I don't have, parrots who have turkey hawks flying over them and are worried that they're going to be attacked any moment, and actually have some actual true physical safety. So those basic needs are an assumption. We have to make sure we meet those basic needs of that welfare before we start addressing what I would call well-being, which is sort of that higher level that Dr. Rusu described as the PAW concept, the positive animal welfare concept. I would call that well-being. Terminology doesn't matter. We're aiming at the same thing. We want animals who are living an enriched and positive life with a lot of good emotional and mental opportunities in their lives. So with that said, oops, my slide wouldn't advance. I want to really quickly talk about the fact that I'm going to be mixing terms up a little bit here, and I want to quickly discuss what those terms mean and how they will be mixed up. And again, Dr. Rusu did a really nice job of discussing this in a more technical way. So you may hear me say choice, you may hear me say control, and you may hear me say agency. All of these terms are related, and they technically have slightly different meaning. Choice to me, and again, Dr. Rusu brought this up already. It was wonderful to hear all these ideas being expressed. Choice to me is the ability to have at least 2 good choices. That doesn't mean I can go outside or I can stay in a really horrible enclosure that is very unpleasant to me. It means, for example, I can go outside or I can be in my enclosure, which is a wonderful place with lots of enrichment. That would be more what I consider choice. There's at least 2 good options. It's not 1 bad option and 1 other option, but 2 good options. Agency is the animal's sense that they have the opportunity to make those choices. Agency is more about the perception inside the mind of the animal, which I cannot see, by the way. So I don't actually know if they're experiencing agency or not, but agency is about how they perceive their environment more than what their environment really is. They may have choices, but if they don't feel like they have choices, then they don't have agency. And control is the ability to have your behavior affect outcomes around you. So these are all very strongly related concepts. They're not exactly the same. I may be mixing up the terminology here and there. So I hope everyone will be okay with that. So I want to very quickly touch on stress and behavior and why all of this matters. So one of the things that's already been discussed, and I think Dr. Pierdon did a really lovely job of discussing stress and enrichment and how they relate, is that when animals are under stress, you're going to see a lot more behavioral issues. And those could be things like aggression, as discussed in this last presentation, or In companion animals, you'll see what we call misbehavior. I'm making little quote marks here because it's really misbehavior from the point of view of the human. And when animals are under more stress, it actually affects their ability to think clearly. There are changes that happen in the way the brain functions as our stress level increases beyond a certain point. And what it means is that they'll often make behavioral choices that aren't the best choice if you sort of looked at something objectively. But the animal's not in a state where they're able to process and consider outcomes. And so they go to the behavior that is easy or habitual, like us eating popcorn. If anyone here besides me mindlessly eats popcorn, when I'm under stress, I'm more likely to mindlessly eat popcorn. When I'm not under stress, I'm more likely to say, you know, maybe I don't need the popcorn right now. But we tend to fall back on habitual behavior and instinctive behavior when we're under stress. So why does that matter? It matters because a lot of misbehavior arises from stress, and control and stress have a really interesting relationship. There's decades of research that support the concept that control and stress are related, that the more control an animal has, the less stress it has. Now I'm starting here with the opposite. You see less control, more stress. So if I don't have choices, I have no sense of agency, I am likely to be more stressed. That is true for me as a human. It is true for non-human animals. If I have more control, I tend to experience less stress. It's like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, or whatever the proper term is in the country where you speak English, because I know there's more than one word for this. So as control goes up, stress tends to go down. As control goes down, stress tends to go up. And what that means is that increased control and choice lead to better behavior. So I'm just going to really quickly connect the dots for everyone. So when I have more control, I have less stress. When I have less stress, my cognitive abilities, my ability to think clearly, tend to be stronger, which means I will make decisions that make more sense and provide better outcomes. And of course, there's a lot of assumptions built into that. Sometimes whatever is the obvious better outcome choice for a non-human animal doesn't necessarily align with what we as human animals would like them to choose. But there are things that we can do to help them make choices that work well within the framework of what we need. And allowing them to think clearly makes it more easy that they will be able to grab onto those choices. So more control, less stress, better behavior. This is why it's so important for us to provide choice, control, agency wherever possible. And enrichment is a really huge part of that. I will be talking about enrichment more. So one of the questions that came up before the conference was, how can you safely add choice, knowing that animals don't always make wise decisions? And the first thing I want to say is a lot of this comes down to something that in the animal training world, we call management. And what management means is setting up the environment in a way where safety is preserved for both the non-human animal and the human animal, and sometimes making certain choices possible or impossible. So for example, I live in the city of Los Angeles. When I walk a dog in the city of Los Angeles, I have the dog on a leash, because if the dog were not on a leash and they ran into the road, there is a serious risk that they would be hit by a moving vehicle of some kind, car, truck, whatever, and they would be killed. So I can manage that situation by having the animal on a leash. The leash is not my way of dragging the dog around. It's there so that if the dog decides to dart into the street, they don't actually make it into the street and they don't get killed. That's an example of management. It doesn't teach the animal anything. It's just there to prevent them from physically being able to do something that is dangerous, for example. So One way that we can safely add choice with animals who might be dangerous to us is a concept called protected contact. And what you're actually seeing in this image is semi-protected contact, not actually protected contact, just so that you know. If you go into zoo environments, there's all kinds of gradations of protected contact. Protected contact would be there is an impenetrable barrier, a wall between me and the animal, and the animal can't possibly get to me. Most of the time we actually work in semi-protected contact. And what you can see here is this goat who if you've met goats, you know that sometimes they will decide to butt you. If the goat is behind a fence, I am theoretically safer. This person is feeding the goat through the fence. Maybe their fingers are a little bit at risk. I could use some kind of grasping tool to feed if I were worried. And I've seen that done with great cats, for instance, lions, tigers, and so on in zoo scenarios. But the idea is that I can start to give the animal more choices while they are physically separated from me, and make sure that they're making wise choices before I start reducing the level of safety barrier between us. And in some cases, you never reduce the level of safety barrier. But I just want to introduce that concept of protected contact. You can teach an animal long distance through a barrier. It's done all the time in exotic animal zoo and aquarium scenarios. Another way to safely add choice is to teach an animal a station. And here I have an example of two dogs who are each on their own station. You can see that one of these beds is a little bit chewed up, but it is what it is. And if these two were, for example, going to get in a fight or something, I could put these stations really far away. So if you're working with multiple animals, and one of the issues that's coming up is aggression, one way to provide them with more freedom and yet also manage situations where aggression might become an issue is to teach them a very strong station. And stations can be done in a lot of different ways. In this case, we have each of the dogs has a bed as a station. You could have a location in the enclosure. All of the animals who get along in group A go over to that corner. The animals that get along in group B go to this corner, and so on. There's a lot of different ways to do stationing. And I'm actually going to show you some video, which hopefully will play smoothly for everyone. If not, I can always send them to the organizers and we can make sure that you can see these videos properly. So one way to do stationing is actually through using a handheld target. And I've seen this done at aquariums where they have a station that they put up against the glass of the aquarium, and each of the animals within the water knows that's my station. They go and they literally just put their nose against it. So here's a really simple example with a dog. And hopefully you'll be able to hear. And you're going to see this isn't going to go perfectly. So I've got this dowel. Hang on. I've got this dowel, and all the animal needs to do is touch this pink end of the dowel. When he does, I'm clicking and providing food. Don't worry about the click. You actually don't even really need it. But what you're going to see is he doesn't do it perfectly all the time. At some point, he gets a little frustrated with me. He starts jumping on me. I just move the dowel out of the way. This is an animal who is not a threat to me, so I don't need to be in protected contact. But I'm going to show you an example of this with protected contact in just a moment. And you can see, in a moment, you're going to see that I can use this target to move the animal. So now I've got him moved to one side. I move him to the other side. And because this is such a long target, I could use it to get him to stay away from me. Now, I will also add, he did not want to be petted just then. That's a side note. That was me forcing myself onto him. He was not interested in the petting. But you can see how the target can be very simply introduced, and then I could use that to move the animal around. Now, here's an example of protected contact. This is a horse in a stable with a person whose horse this is. I want to, by the way, thank everyone who has allowed me to use their videos, and especially this particular student of mine who allows me to use her videos with her horse because she's marvelous. And what you're going to see is she's got a target, which is here. It's this yellow thing inside the stall. Now, this horse has a tendency to sort of stick his head out over the barrier, and sometimes he nips at her. So we were looking at a way to keep his head safely away from her and yet allow him to be reinforced. And she can hand feed him. That's not a problem. It's just that he gets a little overeager when she approaches the stall. So you're going to see she's going to wait for him to go back and touch that yellow target. Now, she has taught this target before using something like what I showed you in the last video. And every time he touches the target, she feeds him, and then she actually continues feeding him as he stays over there. He gives him a chance to go back over to it. As she walks away from the stall, he's going to come back, and when she comes back, she wants him to go back to that target. So now her standing there is the signal telling him to go to that target instead of being in her space. And what would she do if he did start to stick his head over the edge and get too forward with her? She could just step back because she's in this protected contact. And by the way, I see that there are chat things flying in fast and furious, but I cannot monitor the chat and speak at the same time, so I will look at those later. Okay, so safely adding choice. Another thing you can do is you can teach a default behavior. And this is actually the same horse, Mulligan, with his two horse friends out at pasture, which is a big enriching opportunity for him, by the way, and does make his life better overall. All right, so take a look. Same handler, same horse. The default behavior is that he keeps his head straight ahead, because now we're not in protected contact anymore. And what you're going to see is she's going to move him forward. The horse's name is Mulligan, by the way, and Mulligan will keep his head straight rather than turning towards her, which is where problems can happen, right? As the horse turns towards you, they might step on you. They might start to nibble on you. There are all kinds of things. Horses are large animals. So let's take a look at this default head position that she's training. So you can see he got a little pushy. She waited until he was less pushy, rewarded him for being back away from her. He stays standing at a distance from her with his head straight ahead. And she's going to reinforce, I'm not sure if she's going to reinforce or walk forward this time. And you can see that he's gotten a little bit more agitated, but he is still keeping himself forward. So he walks, he stops with his head forward instead of turned towards her. His body's a little turned towards her, but he's still at a safe distance. So she's teaching him, when I am leading you, I want you pointing straight ahead, not pointing at me. And these are all things that we can teach to animals who are potentially a risk because of their size or strength. Now, that was just a little tiny bit of training. I'd like to spend some time talking about enrichment, because realistically, especially in a situation where we have many animals, such as a production environment, enrichment is going to be one of the easiest ways for us to increase opportunities for choice and control without creating a great deal of cost for the humans. So first thing to think about, and again, this goes back to things that have already been discussed, is what's natural for the animal. What would that animal be doing if they were in the wild? If I did not have this animal in confinement, in a home, in a farm, in an artificially created environment, which I as a human have created for that animal, what would they actually be doing? So for instance, horses would be grazing, which is why having horses out at pasture is so great. Parrots would be collecting random things from the forest, mostly things like nuts and fruit, and shredding them and eating them. There'd be a lot of movement. Foraging is actually a really big part of natural behavior for many animals. Hunting is another natural behavior. Think about those things and how can I plug in, how can I grasp those natural behaviors and provide them for the animal? So I mentioned that I was going to say something about cats. One thing we can do is we can enrich the environment. Cats like to be able to climb on things. When you create an environment where cats can climb, they tend to be happier. They also tend to live better with other cats when they can be on multiple levels because it gives them ways to separate. And cats get along best when they have sufficient space away from each other. This is something that if you had goats, for example, you can also provide this kind of spacing for goats. I actually have an image of that later on. But so we can enrich the environment. We can change the environment so that there are things that are of interest to the animal. Dr. Pierdon already spoke about this to a great extent, so I'm going to leave that there. Social enrichment is the opportunity for social animals, not all animals are social, but the opportunity for social animals to interact with either other animals of their species, you could call that conspecifics, or with animals who are not of their species, heterospecifics. The key is that the social interaction should be positive. So here's an example of play with other species, play between heterospecifics. This is literally a cat and a dog who's actually fairly new to this home, and I just think the video is adorable. And I just want to open your sort of ideas to say sometimes animals can have a really nice time hanging out with animals who are not of their species, though that's not always possible given the environment the animals are living in or the type of animal. So here you can see they're just hanging out. There's a little bit of interaction. Those of you who know cat behavior are going to be very impressed with this cat, at least in my opinion. I think unfortunately, his cat is no longer with us, but he's a doll. And you can see he's got his claws retracted, so he's just using his empty paw. He's inviting, he's soliciting play from the dog. And the dog isn't quite sure what to make of this. The cat is much more confident than the dog. But this is enrichment. This is an opportunity for each of them to be engaging intellectually in something that is not their everyday, well, it becomes their everyday activity, but it gives them a chance to exercise their brain, use their natural behaviors, because play is natural for both cats and dogs in the right circumstances. Nutritional enrichment is a really big one. I talked about grazing animals before, foraging animals. Bottom line is if you can make the food more interesting without creating aggression within the group, it is a really great thing to do. There are food toys out there for cats, for dogs, for parrots, for horses. And again, Dr. Pierdon talked a little bit about the rope toys. Those are a kind of environmental enrichment, but you know, sometimes things like that can be done depending on the species where there's also food involved. So, nutritional enrichment, another type of enrichment. Occupational enrichment means the opportunity to do stuff. And you can see here is a goat. You can't, the image is a little zoomed in, but this goat is actually up on a platform that's high up. And if you've ever dealt with goats, as you know, goats like to climb on stuff. They're very agile animals. Providing them with the opportunity to do that agility is great. And you can teach them to do it on cue if you have sufficient staff and a small enough number of animals. So stuff to do. So with stuff to do, I want to give you an example of training games with a dog, and this is actually training a default behavior. So we are both engaging the animal intellectually and physically, and we're teaching a useful default. So this is a dog who has a habit of nipping at people when they're moving quickly. This is obviously not something that the humans are very happy about. And so we're teaching this dog that as soon as the human stops, she should also stop. And then she starts offering automatically this down that you're going to see. There's no sound on this video, so don't worry that you can't hear anything. So you can see, pardon the shaky cam. This is actually an online session. Again, my clients are so kind to share their videos. And you can see he moves, then he stops. This time she forgets to follow him, which is fine. Any second now she's going to start running after him. And when he stops, she stops. He feeds her a treat. That's the exchange we're making. We're asking her to do something that doesn't come naturally, and we are rewarding her with food. And you're going to see on this next, it's not this next one, this next pass coming up, you're going to see the dogs getting really excited. So we actually ended the game after this one because she's getting a little too excited. Her tail's wagging in a more exuberant way. And so I actually asked him to end here. So we just practiced for 1 minute. But what we're trying to teach her is when people move around, instead of nipping, stop, settle yourself. Sensory enrichment is another option. And I think I'm looking at time. I think I'm okay on time to show this. Sensory enrichment can be things like having different scent in the area or having different surfaces under the animal's feet because it feels different and it's interesting. All of those things are enriching, and there's a lot of different kinds of sensory enrichment. I'm going to show you a quick opportunity, a quick example, and I apologize for the very triggering thing in the background here, of a dog who is hunting for stuff in boxes. There's no sound on this video because the, oh wait, no, there is sound. Hang on, I'm going to cut the video because the TV's on in the background. And you can see he's hunting for food in boxes. It is really that simple. Some of the boxes have food, some of them don't. This one's a puzzle because the food is underneath. He solves the puzzle. He's going to go look in another box. This is just a simple way for him to use his nose and have fun. And this is something that we've trained up. We didn't start with this many boxes. And in fact, he does more than a dozen boxes at a time. He's looking to see if there's anything outside. In a minute, he's going to look at me and say, are there more boxes? And I'm going to say, yes, please keep going. And he's going to go find the last one, which is actually a box lid. And I just want to point out that this dog used to be afraid of boxes. So it's really lovely to see how this kind of enrichment improved his cognitive bias. He is now optimistic when these strange things show up. One other thing I want to talk about, and then I'm going to leave some time for questions, and I have some bonus videos if we have time, is reducing stress through improved communication. And what I mean by this is, now this is a luxury that we're only going to be able to do on an individual animal basis in most cases. But things like veterinary care and husbandry, grooming, can be done with the animal opting in. I'm only going to touch on this really briefly. If anyone wants to learn more about this, let me know. I will happily run a course where I delve more deeply into all of this if there's interest. But reducing stress through improved communication. So I'm going to show you, this is me and my personal dog, and I'm going to be trimming his nails. And he's going to say, yes, you can continue. And I'm only going to trim his nails when he says, yes, you can continue. Now, I want to point out, this is a Dremel tool. It's a kind of, what's the word I want? It's a kind of file. It files the nails. So I'm not clipping the nails. I'm actually filing them. It's a rotating file of kinds. So there's a noise that goes with it as well. And he gets to say yes, and I'm going to stop and point out all the different ways he says yes. So, first way he says yes. Hi. Good boy. That was it, lying down on the mat. If he does not want to participate in the animal husbandry that I am about to do, all he has to do is stand up and walk away from that mat, or not come to the mat in the first place. Now, I am going to feed him for participating, but he can always say no and walk away. So, where's our next yes coming in? You ready to roll over? Or you going to just stay there and look at me? You're a good boy. Good boy. Okay, you don't kipper. So I'm just making sure he knows what's going on. Now, I'm not actually pushing him over. Watch my hands carefully. Can you see? I'm going to go back here. I want you to notice that my hands are there because this is my way of asking him, are you ready to roll over? But I am not pushing his body. Watch my hands really carefully. Can we get you to roll over for me? One way or the other? Good boy! And you see he rolled all by himself. He's a little excited because he knows there's going to be food. So now he's on his side, and his being on his side is the second yes. So first yes was, oh, sorry, I created balloons. First yes was, I'm on the mat. Second yes was, I'm on my side, and now you're allowed to trim my nails. And if I straighten up, please stop trimming my nails. It's all about him being able to tell me yes or no. So right now he's not quite ready. I'm looking to see if he's ready. I'm rearranging myself. I'm like, you know what? I'll do his back end first. He says, great, you can start. So every time he gives me a yes or a no, I'm happy to feed him. So he says, that's fine. That's the sound of the file. It's a rotating drill with sandpaper on it. And you can see I'm doing a bunch with his nails. I am actually rounding his nails so he doesn't scratch things as much. And then I feed him. I still have his foot. He's looking at his foot. That was the yes again. So did you all see? I'm holding his foot. He hasn't asked me to release his foot, but then he starts looking at his foot, so I wait. Then he leans over. There's my yes. And I continue to trim his nails. And I know you kind of can't see past my hair. I'm sorry about that. Stationary camera. Yep. And then he gets another treat, and we go on in this way. And I'm going to make my way around all of his nails. Now, obviously, we did not start like this. There was a whole training process that got us here. But I'm trying to give you an idea of the possibilities. You can do this with injections, you can do this with blood draws, you can do this with almost any kind of handling. And in fact, in the exotic animal world, they often spend, it takes time, they often spend months teaching animals how to voluntarily submit to veterinary procedures so that they don't have to sedate them, because it takes one more element of risk out of the veterinary procedures. So just something to think about. Another thing to think about, I'm just going to show you, this is a little communication between my husband and my dog. And this is something that just happened organically. We did not plan this, it just happened. They came up with this communication. My dog really liked to sit between the coffee table and the couch. That was where he liked to be. So we would be watching television. I believe we're watching American football here based on what's happening in the background of the video. And the dog wants to get between the couch and the coffee table. I want you to see the communication. I'm going to play this twice. So he walks up, hello, looking at my husband. Hello. See how my husband obediently puts his legs up? And now they're both happy. My husband gets to pet his dog. My dog gets to be petted in a way that he's clearly enjoying if you look at his face. But who initiated this? The dog initiated this. Hello. The dog is the one with the agency here. He knows I can make Dad move his feet. I can make Dad give me a spot here, and I can get petting. And my husband is being obedient to the dog, not the other way around. So obviously there's two-way communication going here, but my point is that often animals will come up with good ideas if we're paying attention, And then we can have a whole conversation with them and develop a relationship that we might not otherwise have. Now, obviously, that part is a little bit more geared towards companion animals, but it is an idea we can carry forward in all of our interactions. So, whoops, sorry. Other things to consider: sleep and rest. These are really important. Many animals do not get sufficient sleep and rest in artificial scenarios because of threats to their safety or a sense that their safety is threatened. If you have, for example, two companion animals living in your home and one of them is consistently attacking the other, the animal that is being attacked may not feel safe enough to sleep soundly. That increases their stress. When their stress is increased, their behavior deteriorates. So think about sleep and rest. Sometimes that means an animal will need their own space. That is not always appropriate. Know the ethology of the animals you're dealing with. There are some animals that if you separate them, it's actually very, very stressful for them. So do know your animals. But consider rest, sleep, in addition to food, shelter, and safety and rest and sleep overlap in a lot of ways. The key is, as much as possible, we want to provide a choice-rich life. And by the way, I just have to say, like, I want this cat in my home. I just love this cat. This cat looks so happy. But as much as possible, we're going to add choice. And what that means is we're going to think about what the animal needs to thrive, which includes rest. We're going to use protected contact and other management tools to increase safety for us and for the animal. We're going to promote better choices through regular training. And it can be as simple as teaching a target and saying every time someone walks into the enclosure, you all go to your corners. And that way the human can do whatever they need to do in the enclosure safely without the animals invading the space. Maybe at first we use protected contact. Over time, we can take those barriers away. We then promote better choices. I think I just said this, through regular training, use enrichment to increase agency and to promote that positive cognitive bias so that animals generally say good stuff is likely to happen, which means they're approaching life with a more positive emotional state. Positive emotional states are associated with less distress, better choice making, better behavior. And evaluate and adjust everything you're doing on a regular basis, because every animal is an individual. Every group of animals is going to be different. When you add an animal or remove an animal from a group, everything's going to change. So always be ready to adjust. You can get in touch with me with the information listed here. I'm going to leave that up for just a second. And I want to thank everyone who has made this possible. I want to thank Sunday and Dr. Sunday and the amazing staff. I want to thank you all for listening. I hope this has given you some ideas, and I would love to hear your questions. And I'm going to stop my share right here. I do have some bonus videos if we wind up having extra time at some point.
Okay, we sincerely thank you, Irith Bloom, for your role in promoting informed, compassionate approaches to animal welfare. So I've been able to understand that we use enrichment to increase agency. We have the environmental enrichment, nutritional enrichment, to make food more interesting for our animals, like incorporating food toys and occupational enrichment and also sensory enrichment. Thank you so much for that very detailed and pictorial presentation. So now we'll be taking a few questions from the audience. So kindly drop your questions for Irith in the chat box. So while we're waiting for the participants to drop their questions, I have some pre-conferences questions for you, Irith. So I'll be reading them out to you now. Okay. So can we discuss the limits of freedom to choose for companion animals, since no matter what we decide, every important life decision for them, and realistically, if they had their choice all the time, they often would choose unsafe and unreasonable actions: overeating, roaming at will, destroying things, chasing cars, etc. Isn't it rather that we should give them limited choice and more autonomy, include them, listen to them? The fact is, we still have to force them to do things often for their own good, go to the vet, take a bath, and in some cases walk, even if they might choose not to us, for example. So I am noticing that the current global focus on freedom to choose for animals has a great core value and is legitimate, but must be framed with some parameters and not become an empty trope that makes people feel good but is not connected to real animal management or care. This is from Michael Kaufman from United States of America.
Thank you so much. That's a really excellent question. And there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm not sure I'll be able to quite address it as fully as I would like. What I will say is what I personally look to do is improve the well-being of the animal. And there are actual metrics you can look at. You can look at, is the animal's health improving? Do they show more joy? Are they exploring more? Exploratory behavior is something that most animals will only do when they feel safe and confident in the situation that they're in. Confident is a little bit of a construct, so I will leave that word aside. But yes, if I have a horse and that horse is not a Mustang who's living in the Western United States and wandering free, if it's a horse that's in my care, odds are it's not wandering free. That means that I am necessarily putting enclosures around that animal. They will be on a lead line. They will be in a stall. They will be in a pasture. Maybe the pasture is very large, but it's still confined. And all of those things are definitely things that we need to bear in mind. So the way I tend to look at it is, there are certain parameters I can't get away from. I can't let my horse run free because I don't know what will happen to them. They might get attacked by a predator. In the Western United States, we have great cats, we have wolves, we have all kinds of things that might damage the animal's physical health, literally. And yet I also want to maximize the well-being of that animal. So what I do is I say, where are my limits? Where is it that these are the things I can't change. What can I change within that? So some of those things are adding a lot of enrichment, asking the animal whenever I can, which means, for example, since veterinary care is one of the things that was specifically asked about in this question, I do whatever I can to make veterinary care cooperative, like what you saw with the nail trimming. So I actually train that in advance. Now, if my animal is hit by a car, am I going to wait for the animal to say, yes, you can take me to the vet? No, that's an emergency scenario. But I'm going to try to reduce the number of situations where I force a choice or I force the treatment on the animal and increase the number of times when I can add a choice. Obviously, if the animal's doing something dangerous, they're presenting, a danger to society, then I'm going to have to limit them more severely. And I think of choice as something that, unfortunately, in some cases, is not as possible for some animals as for others due to their own learning history, their background, because of bad things that happened to them when they were very young, because of realities of our society. But wherever I can, I'm looking to add those options. And you can start small. You can start with, I'm going to ask you if you want it to be petted rather than just petting you without asking. Or you can start with, I'm going to teach you how to do a voluntary blood draw, knowing that I don't need to do a blood draw for the next year, and we're going to work on this gradually. You can start with one thing at a time and then start expanding. And the thing that I will say is, if you're going to start with anything, start with enrichment, because enrichment provides opportunities. The technical definition of enrichment that I like to use is opportunities to engage in species typical behavior. That means chances to do what the animal would do if they were to do behaviors that are similar to what they would do in the wild. Start with that in ways that are safe and then build outwards from there, knowing that in the end, unless it is a feral dog living in some environment like, I know in Southeast Asia, there are a lot of feral dogs that live free. Odds are they're not going to have complete freedom and they are going to have certain restrictions, but within those restrictions, let's maximize their well-being. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Another question from the chat box from Licolin Kurtzi. Considering that stress and control in animals are related, and most mammals also have a vague nerve, does this mean one can apply Pog's polyvagal theory on stress when studying animal behavior?
So I am not familiar with this polyvagal theory on stress. I'm just going to say that right now because I saw it's Porges' polyvagal theory on stress. So I unfortunately cannot comment on this. However, Nicolene, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, give me time to research that, send me an email, and I will give you an answer.
Okay, thank you so much, Irith. Another one from Akinyemi Rukayat from the chat box. She said, from what I could see in your illustrations, it seems all the trainees come with rewards. Should the animals always be rewarded so as to take or do the trainings?
Okay, wonderful question. I love this question. Thank you so much. So I do all reward-based training. I have thousands of colleagues working with different species of animals where we all exclusively use reward-based training. We use management, where I said, things like limiting the options to ensure safety and to promote the kind of behavior that we want to see. Let me give you an example of management to promote the kind of behavior we want to see. If I want to teach a dog to walk on leash, a really easy management technique to help the dog learn to walk on leash is to teach the behavior in a narrow hallway, because the animal is going to tend to stay close to me because there's nowhere else to go. So I may change the environment in ways like that to promote the behavior being more likely, but in the end, the animal is going to get rewarded with food or play or something else that is motivating for that animal. In most cases, food is the easiest thing to do, but it's not always the best one. But there are some animals that don't work well for food, and then we find other things to reinforce with. Let me get back to my main point. Once that animal is walking next to me in the hallway, they're going to be fed for being next to my hip. And then as we expand into a larger room, they've already learned being next to my hip gets them fed. Positive reinforcement is an extremely successful way, based on a lot of research and data, extremely successful way to teach behavior. I do not use punishment within my training context. I mean, in an emergency situation, will I grab an animal in a way that they might not love in order to protect their safety? Yes, but I don't consider that a training tool. So I do everything using positive reinforcement. If I can't find a way to do it with positive reinforcement in the moment, I stop. I leave the situation. I think about how I could do this with positive reinforcement. How can I set up my environment better? What kind of reinforcer can I use? Is it food? Is it play? Is it the opportunity to go talk to another dog or whatever it might be? And I revisit it once I've come up with a different training solution. And I do reevaluate my training all the time.
Okay. Thank you, Harriet. Another question from one of the participants. Regarding veterinary procedures, the animal owner proud training of the animal is very important. How can we achieve this?
So that's such an excellent question. The veterinary profession, there are more and more veterinarians who are trying very hard to do what's called cooperative care, where you, the veterinarian and the animal, or the veterinary staff and the animal, are cooperating in the care of that animal. And one of the things I will say is there's an organization in the United States called Fear Free Pets. I want to say it's fearfreepets.com. They have a lot of resources for how to get started. They have resources both for people who are living with companion animals and for veterinarians to learn more about how to do procedures in a cooperative way that is less stressful. But one of the things is, you can talk to, if you are trying to convince someone to start down this path, you can talk to them about, for example, visiting the dentist. Here for me in the United States, when I visit the dentist, I've got my mouth open and I can hardly talk, right? We have a signal. I can hold up my hand and they'll stop doing what they're doing. Think about how you would feel if you had your dental care done and your dentist didn't give you any signal to make them stop. How scary could that be? And I'm not even afraid of dentists, and I think that sounds scary. So sometimes coming up with an analogy for something, how would you feel as a human if I just ran up to you suddenly and jabbed a needle in you, which is something that we sometimes do with animals. With no warning, bam. How would that feel to you? Now think about how that feels to your animal. Now, how is it different when I say, here's what I'm going to do. Are you ready? There's going to be a little stick. Can I explain that to a horse? There's going to be a little stick? No, but I can teach them, here are all the predictors in the environment, and then you're going to get the little stick, and then you're going to get some really nice oats, which will make you happy, and the little stick doesn't hurt so much. So using those analogies of how would it be for me as a human if I got medical care without my consent can sometimes help the person start to be interested in helping their animal have the right to consent to these procedures.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful answer. But because of time, we'll be taking the last question. But Irith, we would like to suggest that you help us check through the chat to respond to some of the outstanding questions. So we'll be taking this last question. So the person said, my question is in some animals, especially birds, broiler precisely. If you don't restrict feed consumption, the bird will consume more. The farmer will spend more on feed consumption.
Right. So this is where I'll say two things. So restricting food to a healthy amount for that animal is a consideration in many species. You don't want them overeating. So if you are doing training with individual animals, you build that into your feed plan. So I would literally, if I'm working with a horse, say, and they get, I don't know, a cup of oats. I'm just making up a cup. It's probably less than they would really get. A cup of oats a day. I'm going to make sure that because the oats are very valuable to them, I'm going to make sure that I'm using those oats in training and that they only get the leftover of that in their feed, because otherwise I will be overfeeding them with oats. So I would do the same thing with the bird. I would say, what is the amount you're supposed to have? That's going to go into either food toys or training or freely provided food, which they may or may not be as interested in. And I will not give you any more than that. Now, if you're working with an entire flock, then it becomes a little bit more complex and there may need to be more feeding stations to separate the birds, or you might just need to use a more traditional feeding method and use other kinds of enrichment, or find something that's very low calorie. But I don't know for birds what that would be. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas.
Yes, thank you, Irith, for your compassionate approaches to animal welfare. Thank you. So now we'll be moving on to the next presenter. Thank you. So we now move to our next presentation. Please kindly stay engaged to the last presentation of today's conference and continue to share your questions in the chat. Irith Bloom will be there to answer your questions. So let me introduce our third speaker. She has been interested in the cooperation between humans and animals since childhood. After obtaining a BS and DVM from Cornell University, she spent 13 years in multi-species veterinary practice with a specific interest in behavior. Wanting to better understand the relationships between people and animals, she returned to school to complete a PhD in biobehavioral health at Penn State, focusing on the behavior and physiology of stress in dogs. She currently teaches companion animal science classes and conducts research on human-animal interactions and canine welfare at Penn State. Through the years, she has volunteered to take pets to visit residents in skilled nursing homes, educated children and parents on dog bite prevention and introducing pets to new babies, studied working dog behavior, and studied the welfare of dogs participating in these interactions. Since 2014, she has organized a group of students and community members to raise puppies as future assistance dogs through collaboration with Susquehanna Service Dogs, an assistance dog international accredited organization, presenting on the effect of fear and distress on health, behavior, and lifespan in companion animals. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nancy Dreschel. Please join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage. You're welcome, Dr. Nancy.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are coming from. I'm really thankful for the technology that we have that allows us all to meet across the world at this time and discuss these things that are so important. And I'm really excited about the things that are happening in Africa and across the world in the concept of behavior and welfare in our animals. So today I'm going to be talking about kind of the negatives of not providing choice and not doing some of the things that we've been talking about. And so particularly looking at the effects of fear, distress on health and behavior and lifespan in particular in companion animals. So my focus is on companion animals. There'll be a lot of dog pictures in here probably, but we'll go ahead and get started. So first off, I just want everyone to kind of check in and how are you feeling today? I use this slide with my students all the time, especially on the first day of class. Kind of, we often have people coming from a lot of different places and just kind of checking in. How are you feeling? I don't expect you all to answer this, but hopefully some of you at least are in that upper, I don't know if I have a pointer here, the upper corner here of the happy, interested dog, maybe wondering what's going on, but hopefully nobody's antagonistic here. So when I think about behavior and when I talk with my students, one of the primary things I always think about is that we have to keep in mind the interactions between genetics and the environment and the brain and how all of those things work together. It's easy to kind of focus, and especially when I'm talking with specific groups, sometimes people genetics is what they focus on, is breed or the specific type of dog, or they only focus on the environment and they forget that animals come with all this previous development that's come with them. And this is a slide that I put together that just looks at, you know, we have to consider individual factors. So those are things like genetics, the health of the animal, the age of the animal, the, you know, what is that animal doing? What job does it have, or what is it, what does it do every day? And that is one aspect, and these things all tie together. Then there's environmental effects. What is the physical environment of the animal? What is the social environment of the animal? And our previous speakers have done a really nice job at talking about some of these directions that animals come with whether they should be housed socially, or if it's an animal that doesn't get along with other animals, maybe they should be housed by themselves. You know, what is the physical environment? What is the training that that animal has had in the background? Have they been trained with positive reinforcement? Do they look forward to working with people? So those things, and then all of this ties together with development of the animal throughout their lifespan. How, you know, what was their maternal behavior like? All of these things tie into this. So when I think about stress and distress, and I'm going to give kind of a background of stress and where we currently think about stress right now. The one thing that I always have to look at is kind of that individual again. Like, how are they perceiving when we talk about stress? There's a stimulus that's coming in. whether that's an environmental stressor or a psychological stressor, some stimulus is coming into the animal that the animal is then going to perceive and process. And how that animal perceives that stimulus is going to be key in determining whether a stress response is even going to occur or not. Part of this may be genetic and at a very basic level. So just trying to, I just lost my thing here. So at a very basic level, so Zapata and colleagues looked at, they mapped fear and aggression traits based on the CBARC, which is a canine behavioral questionnaire that's often used. And they were able to look at that, and then they found that there were actually specific loci on genes that were mapped to the amygdala and the hypothalamus that were specifically associated with some of these anxiety and depression traits. So we know that genetics is a view here. I lost my picture. So so again, how they, the other thing that they might be responding to is, or whether they can respond to a stimulus or not might have to do with their morphology, right? So if we look at this, this bloodhound, whether that animal hears something or not may be very different than how a Malinois would hear something, because Malinois have those pricked up ears and the bright eyes they can see, whereas a bloodhound has those real heavy ears. They're not going to perceive sound and vision in the same way that a Malinois may. The other thing that ties into this is the animal's previous experience. If we have an animal that is afraid of thunderstorms, then when they hear thunder, they're going to respond to that. If we have an animal that's not afraid of thunderstorms, they may not respond to that. So all of these things really will tie into how this animal is going to react. I'm not sure what happened to my, here we go. I'm sorry, my my display got a little weird. The other thing, talking about, when Dr. Pierdon was talking about cognitive bias, that's another thing that can also play into that, is how does the animal, do they have an optimistic outlook? Do they have a pessimistic outlook? All of these things can tie into that. So looking at stress, so we use the word stress very commonly to mean all different kinds of things. Basically, when I'm thinking about physiological stress, I'm looking at the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. So this was Hans Selye back in 1936, so almost 100 years ago now, looked at how the body, how the organism or the system changes or adapts to changes. So we can look at any particular variable that may be going on in a system. So if we say heart rate, a stimulus will come in, it produces a change in heart rate. That's going to knock the homeostasis a little bit off balance. And that change will be detected by a receptor, and then things will happen within the body to try to bring that back into homeostasis. So as we go through this, you can look at this could be either too much, the heart rate increases too much, or the heart rate decreases too much, and then we try to get it back into a maintenance within certain boundaries. And that's what homeostasis is. Stress is things that affect that, right? So anything that comes in that affects that balance. We use the word stress in a very casual way now. And looking over, you know, when I think about the past 25 years that I've been looking at stress and humans and animals, and how that has changed, how our understanding of it has changed, I think is important when we talk about these things. So, you know, the most basic is, and this is from Dr. Liu et al. In 2021, publishes really interesting study or review of stress and the terminology that we use to describe it. So moving from just, oh, stimulus causes a stress, causes a response, and causes an effect, to kind of our more modern day looking at what stress is. And so we look at, there's a stimulus that may or may not be viewed as a stressor, and then that's going to either affect homeostasis or not. So if homeostasis is not challenged, then we talk about sous-stress, which is, I think of this as kind of more the boredom, right? There's nothing going on. We're kind of at a flat line. There's not a lot of variation in that homeostasis. And this can actually be detrimental to the animal as well, right? So this is kind of lack of stress altogether. Nothing's going on. If we have a mild challenge to homeostasis, kind of what I was talking about, where, you know, it just goes up a little bit or down a little bit, but then kind of equilibrates, we talk about that as being eustress. And eustress is a valuable, beneficial thing for a system. We need a little bit of stress or in our lives, right? Animals need a little bit of challenge. If it's flatline, when I think about flatline, I think about the EKG, right? There's nothing going on. That's not good either. So a little bit of stress, what we call eustress, may be beneficial. If the system is strongly challenged, that's when we get into distress. And distress is what we think of as kind of what most people will just say as stress, right? It's a severe stress response, and it actually is damaging to the system. That's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about the effects of health, or the effects on health of these stressful situations. So kind of just carrying on with this, stress isn't always bad, right? So eustress, a lot of people will consider this to be good stress, right? So I have an example here of a dog that's in a training, actually it's being tested to detect narcotics in a prison warehouse. And the dog has found what she's supposed to find. You can see her handler is really excited. He's happy. It's a good time. She actually happens to be an active alert dog, so she's kind of tearing into the package a little, which is not generally what they want, but that is her sign. So she's doing a good job. She's happy. She's excited. Eustress motivates us, right? Eustress helped me to prepare for this talk, right? It gives us, it makes things exciting. It usually eustress is perceived as being within our control. When we talk about control or coping mechanisms, eustress is something that we feel like we can cope with, versus distress. And so for this, I use this dog, a search and rescue dog at a site where there were no survivors. And this dog has been searching day in, day out, and had not found any live people. So its whole job was being not working. You can tell the handlers are looking pretty dejected. This is a very sad, horrible situation. The dog's ears are back. He's doing some lip licking. He's not comfortable. This would be distress. Now, that doesn't mean that this dog is under horrible condition and should not be doing this, but it meant that they needed to step in and they needed to provide some relief for this dog and for the handlers. And so what they did is they played some games, and they had people hide, the rescuers and other people who were on site. that weren't actively working right then would hide so that the dog could go and find them. And the dog would find them, the dog was successful, and that decreased that stress in that situation. So distress is not always, distress becomes a problem when it's constant, right? So, but it's not necessarily horrible when it first happens. It just is an indication that we need to step in. So what exactly happens when an animal is stressed? The most, I always think about the two branches of the stress response. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which is a really rapid, short-acting response to an acute stressor. So the animal perceives a stressor through the hypothalamus. This is an autonomic response, right? So it's not processed through the cerebrum at all. It just comes in through the hypothalamus. It signals directly through nerves to the thoracolumbar region, where it's passed again through nerves with norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter, causing all these things that we normally see, right? And we think about these often when we think about stress: dilated pupils, dry mouth. The airways will expand so that we can get more oxygen in. The heartbeat increases. The stomach activity decreases, right? So there's a decrease in blood flow to the stomach, increase in blood flow to the brain and to the vital organs. So this is a really quick response. It's very rapid. It doesn't last very long. And this is often to a really acute stressor. Something happens, there's a loud noise, something frightening happens, and we have this response. As soon as we see that, okay, nothing's going on, everything kind of goes back to normal. So while it's a stressor, it is a very acute, quick acting response. In contrast, there's the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this is a longer lasting response. Again, we have the hypothalamus is activated by a stressor coming in that has passed through the amygdala and the cerebrum and is activating, is being processed. Then it gets to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces corticotrophin releasing hormone and vasopressin, which goes to the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland produces adrenocorticotrophic hormone, which is sent into the bloodstream to the adrenal glands, which then produce glucocorticoids. So in the case of dogs and cats, cortisol is the primary glucocorticoid. And so that cortisol then circulates through the bloodstream and has effects on all these different organs, right? So it affects the immune system, it affects the bone marrow, it affects the spleen, it affects lymph nodes. And this is a really, it's a little slower acting, because as opposed to the central or sympathetic nervous system, which is instantaneous nerve transmission, this is depending on the blood flow to circulate this hormone around. So it's a little bit longer acting. Once the stressor is gone, it still may be circulating around for a little while. So maybe up to an hour, we might see some effects of these hormones, even in a really acute response. Chronic stressors, so where we worry is when we start seeing this chronic stressors over and over and over again, where the animal is exposed to something, whether it's aversive training, whether it's an environmental situation, whether they're in a shelter where they don't have, where maybe there's a lot of noise or something like that, then this system is chronically overactivated. That chronic cortisol release then can result in dysregulation of the HPA axis. So this is why it becomes very difficult when we use cortisol as a measurement for long-term stress, because as a short-term stress, we can see that it increases, and we can measure cortisol in saliva and hair and feces and blood. But in a long-term situation, if an animal is kind of awash with chronic cortisol release, that whole axis that we talked about here becomes dysregulated. And so we lose some of these feedback loops, and we can actually end up with a really low level of cortisol so that the animal's no longer able to react. There's a really interesting paper that was published looking at the effect of sheltering on physiology and immune function and behavior, and basically and these were dogs that were in shelters. And what they were trying to look at is, can we distinguish between dogs who have a dysregulated HPA axis and dogs who just maybe they've habituated to the situation, right? So they have a low cortisol because they're not stressed anymore. And they found that it was just very difficult to tell those things apart. So looking at some of the really specific things that occur in response to stress related to the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system is that we get a partitioning of white blood cells. There's a lot of immune changes that happen. So with sympathetic nervous system, we have epinephrine release, and that produces what veterinarians usually call a physiologic leukogram. So basically, neutrophils are moving into the circulation. Leukocytes, other lymphocytes also are mobilized from the thymus and from the bone marrow, so that we see this increase in white blood cells in the blood circulation. In cases of glucocorticoid release, so when the HPA axis is released, then we also see a lot more neutrophils. Sometimes we see not as many lymphocytes. They go back into the bone marrow or lymphatic tissue. With long-term exposure to glucocorticoids, so for example, if we are looking at constant chronic HPA activation, we can see decreased response to immune challenge, right? So this is something that they've actually used to measure immune or stress responses sometimes, is they'll actually go to medical students who are in the middle of their exams and they give them a vaccine, or they'll put a wound on them and see whether they heal as well, because they've shown that increased stress will decrease their ability to respond to an immune challenge. This is important, I think, when we think about our animals that we're taking into different places. So if we're taking an animal into a hospital to visit people, if they are experiencing stress in this situation, they're going to be less likely to mount an immune response to diseases that they may come in contact with, zoonotic diseases, and then would be able to spread those. It also is important in veterinary care. If we're giving a vaccine and an animal is particularly stressed, in the terms of distress, then they will be less likely to mount a good immune response to that vaccine. Other things that we've seen is that animals in a persistent inflammatory state will have cardiovascular effects, right? And so we've seen that increased oxidative stress. An interesting study that was just published showed that animals in stressful situations were produced more more oxidative stress markers, and that those would be more likely to cause inflammation, and then that inflammation then can cause all kinds of problems with the gastrointestinal tract or with the cardiovascular system. I think it's interesting that when we think about stress and we think about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, for instance, that there's also stress that comes from the immune system itself, and that those cytokines that are produced by inflammatory cells, like white blood cells, produce cytokines to talk to each other. Those also feed back in a positive feedback mechanism on the stress response. So immune cells producing cytokines like interleukin-1 or tumor necrosis factor, those feed back and cause more response and cause more release of cortisol in the long run. So it can become kind of a vicious cycle then. In acute stress, this can be very helpful, but in a chronic stress situation, it can be very damaging. So there's a whole study group called of psychoneuroimmunology, a whole field looking at those interactions between the immune system, the central nervous system, and psychology or behavior. So we also see if we have chronic glucocorticoid exposure during the prenatal and early postnatal time, that can have long-lasting effects on the development of the endocrine system, the development of that HPA system, that can have effects on the central nervous system and on future behavior. And these are some studies, primarily these studies have been done in rodents and primates, and basically just showing that prolonged exposure to distress during that early development time could cause an animal to have decreased ability to cope with stress in the future, that the offspring that are born as adults would maybe not be able to cope with stress as well. It causes a disruption of behavior and causes conflict sometimes with other animals. They've also shown retarded motor development or reduced exploratory and play behavior in animals whose mother was stressed when they were in utero. And that then could lead to impairments of learning ability or social behavior, how they get along with others. One thing that I thought was interesting is that they talk about that those delays in motor development or learning ability may be related to the fact, maybe just how they respond to stress. And those may be related to their abnormal HPA axis formation because they're less likely to explore. They're more inhibited. They may not have those play opportunities and opportunities to build those particular behaviors. Another common disease that we see related to stress, this is my call out to the cats, is feline idiopathic cystitis. We know that this is related to that the cats will have bladder issues that are related to toxic factors produced by the neurosteroids and the cortisol affecting the lining of the bladder in those situations. Sometimes the bladder, the angiotensin system is affected and the bladder will not empty as quickly. So we end up with problems related to bladder issues. So cats urinating out of the litter box or inflammation of the bladder itself causing pain and distress in and of itself. It's very commonly seen in cats. It has not been described, as far as I know, in dogs as much, but is a common side effect, basically, of stress in cats. In some species, we've seen chronic stress related to decreased telomere length, so which this could be related to how quickly an animal ages. This, again, as far as I know, this hasn't been really looked at in dogs, but it's an area of, definitely in future study. We know that stress has an important effect on gastrointestinal health. So we have decreased, we talked about that sympathetic nervous system will decrease the blood flow to the intestinal tract or the gastrointestinal tract during chronic stress. And so we end up with increased gut permeability. Those junctions between the mucosal cells will become kind of looser, I think about. And so then that can be released, can increase inflammation and then allow bacteria, harmful bacteria, into the system. It also can change the microbiome. We don't really understand very much yet, but we are really looking a lot at the microbiome and how that is related to cortisol, the increase of certain populations, which can then affect the brain. There's a whole brain gut axis, which is just beginning to be understood. A lot of the knowledge that we have so far is small sample sizes that we're looking at, but definitely there are things going on. I'd say most of the research at this point has been looking at how can we change the stress or fear response through changing the diet or administering probiotics or things like that. A study that I had done a number of years ago looked at dogs. It was a survey of dogs that had actually the owners of dogs who had been deceased, and we looked at what were the what were the behavioral effects that they had through their lives, what were some of the experiences that they had, and what kind of diseases that we saw. And we saw that dogs with extreme non-social fear and separation anxiety had an increased severity and frequency of skin disorders. We know that skin disorders can be painful and they're also inflammatory. So it's hard to tell cause and effect here. Were dogs fearful of people because they had skin irritation, or did the skin irritation cause them to be fearful of people? So different, looking at the cause and effect in those things can be difficult. The other thing that I found in that study that I thought was particularly interesting was that we looked at how well behaved the dog was. So there was a question we asked about training, we asked about all these behavior questions, and then we just asked, how well behaved was your dog, just on a 1 to 5 scale. And what we found was that how well behaved the dog was, how well the owner perceived the dog to be, was really positively correlated with lifespan and extended lifespan. Interestingly enough, while how well behaved the dog was and how well trained they were really highly correlated, there was no correlation between how well trained they were and their lifespan. And I think that really speaks to me, I think it speaks to that relationship that we have with our dogs, and that it doesn't necessarily matter whether a dog is really well trained, but how do they fit into our lives, right? How does their behavior, how do we like their behavior? How do they get along with us? And I think that probably speaks more to their lifespan and the amount of stress that maybe they had through their lifespan than, how well they performed specific, obedience type training. So I would say that the training that Irith was talking about would probably fall more into that well-behaved part, right? That the animal is accepting of things, that they are, they're not causing problems in the household and things like that, versus, you know, kind of standard obedience training. Also interesting enough that fear of strangers was also really related to a significantly shorter lifespan, which again, hard to tell cause and effect when we're looking at a cross-sectional retrospective study. But I think some of the studies that are out there now, they're collecting information through the Dog Aging Project and the Golden Retriever Lifetimes project. These long-term studies, I think, will be able to shed some more light on that. So just in conclusion, because I like to show my puppies, you know, I think providing choices in animal handling and training, all the things that we've heard talked about today, can really lead to just better relationships between people and their pets, and people and animals in general, whether they're pets, whether they're farm animals, that having that improved quality of relationship will decrease the amount of distress that they have. Maybe increase some of that eustress, because we are asking them to do things, and we're providing choices. Choices can be, you know, a little stressful. Sometimes you have to make a decision. That could be eustress, right? So I think by providing those opportunities, we improve our relationship with them, and then we can also improve animal health and well-being in the long run. So thank you very much, and I will happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Nancy Dreschel. Your presentation was both enlightening and inspiring. So thank you for advancing the cause of animal welfare. So I've been able to differentiate between eustress and distress, that eustress is good stress and all stress are not always bad. Thank you. So we'll be taking questions from the live chat. So there's a question from Azadeh Jalali. Apart from cortisol, other hormones such as oxytocin may also increase during acute. I doubt the question is not complete yet. That's the question, Dr. Nancy.
So the question was,
apart from
other hormones, such as oxytocin. Yes, I'm sorry, I missed. Yes, and that's definitely something that a lot of people are looking into, because oxytocin, we think of as being a friend to be friend. They talk about it as being an attachment hormone, right? And so we see that in response to particularly I think that comes in with the HPA axis, where we see this release of oxytocin, which can increase bonding between animals or between people and animals. And that's a really interesting area that we see.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nancy. There's another question from Irith Bloom. She said, thank you so much for the discussion on stress and eustress and distress. Are you familiar with Bruce McEwan's good, tolerable toxic stress model?
I am. I'm not, I have definitely heard of it and have talked about it. And I think that follows very well with what the whole stress, eustress, distress model is. I think they really are very similar, that we need, again, that in between, and then the strong. And I will definitely look more into that as well. Thank you.
Yes, also another question from Likulin Kwetzi. Thank you for the very informative presentation. Research in psychology shows that psychotherapy can be used to change the genetic predisposition to certain conditions, such as depression in unborn babies. What do you suggest one do for animals to mitigate such genetic predispositions?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think we need to, for one thing, I don't think that we understand enough about this, but I definitely think that providing a less stressful environment for females when they're pregnant, and then providing support when they have that maternal behavior is also very important. And so the changing the epigenetics during that time of just providing a less chronic distressful environment for females that are pregnant could be useful.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Dr. Asfa. Please suggest that which hormones are significantly increased due to chronic stress on farm animal, transportational, in developing country context.
So transportation of animals, definitely, I think cortisol is going to play a role in that. Anytime that we have a chronic stress situation, I think cortisol is the primary hormone that we're concerned with. Transportation is always a potential stressor. And so looking at how can we, I think some of the things that we've talked about so far with choice and pre-training. So if we're talking about, we're talking about, you know, moving animals in a truck or something like that, getting them used to that, kind of preconditioning them to some of those things that they're going to face later, just like Irith was talking about cooperative care. Letting them be exposed to some of those things in a mild way just when they're young and being socialized, I think could relieve some of those stressors that they will then face when they're older in those like transportation type situations.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nancy. Another question from Dr. Innocent Nwalgu. Please enlighten us on stress markers, indicators, and the measurements in animals.
That's a really good question, and that's something that I'm very interested in. Some of the key indicators that we use, cortisol has been used for years and definitely plays a role, I think, because we can measure it in saliva, we can measure it in feces, we can measure it in urine, we can measure it in hair, and all of those have their roles. The challenges are that any one marker, so if we use cortisol or if we use oxytocin or if we use heart rate, we could use respiratory rate. People use heart rate variability, like how much does the heart rate change between different EKG models. The problem is that when we use any of those by themselves, they tend to give a very limited view. And when we end up with things like chronic stress, which maybe has decreased our cortisol to a level where the animal no longer can produce cortisol to respond, it's no longer useful. So I think, you know, looking at my recommendation is always using multiple markers. So maybe we'll use cortisol and heart rate variability, cortisol hopefully getting at that HPA axis, heart rate variability maybe getting at the sympathetic nervous system, and then looking at what is the animal telling us through their behavior. What are we seeing as far as stress responses? Are they lip licking? Are their ears back? What is their posture? All those behavioral signs of stress together. So I usually like to look at multiple measures at the same time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nancy. We'll be taking the final question, but please we'll suggest that you check through the chat to respond to some of the outstanding questions. So the last question is from Professor Vivian Oleforu from Nigeria. And the question is, are there culturally diverse interpretations of animal welfare? And how can this influence what we define as meaningful freedom for animals? Then the second question, how do we ethically justify imposing constraints on animal autonomy for the sake of human benefit, and where should the line be drawn?
Those are two good questions. And I think, so I think just addressing the second, I can't even remember the first one, I'm sorry.
The first question, are there culturally diverse interpretations of animal welfare, and how can this influence what we define as meaningful freedom for animals?
Great. Yes, thank you. I see them now. So absolutely, there are going to be diverse interpretations of animal welfare. I think, and this is something that I struggle with. I think that everybody struggles with, because but what it comes down to is the animal, right? And how the animal, we can interpret welfare, but when we look at welfare science, we're looking at what is the animal actually experiencing? What is the quality of life for that animal? And while different cultures and different individuals within cultures certainly may view this on a broad spectrum, that, well, we should be able to do anything we want, when it comes down, that's kind of more of a animal rights issue. When we look at animal welfare, it's really, how is that animal actually responding? So when we look at meaning of freedom, that was really more of a cultural animal rights idea than an actual welfare, because welfare is, what is the quality of life for that animal? I think we can definitely still impose constraints on animal autonomy, right? Because at this point, humans are not totally free either. There is that, it's definitely a very personal thing as to how we work with animals, and whether that's ethical or not. I think, to me, I do enjoy the companionship of animals. I do enjoy working with animals in different situations, whether it's taking them to a nursing home or raising them to work for somebody to decrease their disability or to mitigate their disability. But that is a personal thing. And I think that my idea is that any way that we can ensure that that animal is having a good quality of life and has well-being is a step in working with them instead of just using them. So that's my opinion.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful answer. Thank you again, Dr. Nancy Dreschel, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, so we're moving on to the next presentation. Please stay engaged and continue to share your questions in the chat. Dr. Nancy Dreschel will be there to answer the outstanding questions. So the next presenter, we're making a short presentation about the International Association for Human-Animal Interactions Organization, IIO, to encourage membership by other African professionals and organizations. Dogalov is a member and also the regional representative of IIO for Africa. So presenting on positive animal welfare in human-animal interactions, the case of IIO, it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Professor Alina Rusu. Please join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage once again. You're welcome, Professor Alina.
Thank you, thank you. Hello again. It was a fantastic day, and congratulations to the organizing team. Every word was so insightful, and I'm so happy for this valuable networking that was created today. And I think someday we might think about proposing, this type of conference as a part of training for all the practitioners in the field of animal-assisted services, because we learned how to manage stress, how to do meaningful enrichment by taking into account the agency and so on. And we know that in the field of animal-assisted services, we talk also about farm animals, not only about companion animals. So I don't know how much, my job is nearly done, but I prepared a short presentation and I will share my screen. I know that I have a limited amount of time. Please let me know if you see it, and then I will just share it. Is it okay? Probably you don't see it in now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Sure.
presentation mode now.
Thank you. Now it's in the presentation. Oh, sorry, my cat was. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry, I had a jump from my cat. So my presentation, as proposed by Dr. Sunday Agbonika, is positive animal welfare in human-animal interactions, and we are broadly representing the IHIO, International Association of Human-Animal interaction organization. We also have other colleagues who are here today with us, like Dr. Michael Kaufman from Grim Chimneys, who is an example of good practices around the world for the work in the field of animal-assisted services. And yes. So shortly, you can find all the information about Ohio on the website. It is very generous in terms of resources. But I just make a short summary, and then I will be referring to the approach that we are taking within this organization, which is a leading global association of organizations founded in 1992, with the main mission to promote respectful and responsible human and animal treatment during services and interaction with animals. All these topics were nicely and deeply and insightfully touched today, and I'm really happy for this fantastic conference. So the Ohio is concerned with advancing the field of human-animal interaction, which is accomplished through research. Therefore, we have members and not only associations in the field of human-animal assisted services, which comprises animal-assisted education, animal-assisted treatments, and many other categories. But we also have researchers, so people that are doing research in this field, and they are disseminating their work on sharing it with practitioners, with beneficiaries, people interested in the field, educators, and also it promotes collaboration among its members. Therefore, here we are today due to the existence of Ohio. Also, we are reaching to policymakers around the world and other human-animal interaction organizations, and including animal rescue organizations, social veterinary medicine, that are interested and that can bring insights to the field. So, as I said, Ohio provides networking opportunities by offering webinars, organizing conferences, workshops where it is needed, and it's fostering dialogue, information exchange, and also strategies to move this field forward, and also to promote ethical standards in our interaction with animals. As it was nicely put, we do not use the animals, but we are promoting the idea of collaborating with animals. And literally all the presentations today, they were somehow completing each other, and they created a holistic approach in the direction of us being responsible and also loving the animals that we are coexisting with. And if you look at the Ohio webpage, but also social media page, Instagram, and also you can go to the LinkedIn profile, you will find a lot of information. I just took a screenshot by random, and it was not necessarily by random, because it was an announcement about the Romanian conference that I had the honor to host it, and together with my colleagues, they were all organizers from the board, so that happened in Romania. And you will see a lot of announcements about the webinars, how to access the recorded ones, but also what will be in the future. And also there are statements and white papers translated in various languages, and they keep being updated with guidelines, standards in research, education, all being outcomes and practice, of course, all being the outcomes of working groups. And we are working quite a lot on here. You also see your main organizer, Sunday, is there. He is the regional representative for Africa. I used to be a regional representative, but now I am, since September 2024, I am a member of the board of Ohio. So you can reach out to Sunday for more details regarding the membership, as our moderators already announced, and thank you for that. Why there is a need for guidelines and standards in animal-assisted services? Because, as you already said, also Dr. Dreschel and the other presenters, there are a lot of challenges that are facing this field, applied values of human-animal interaction within the various contexts when we are targeting the presence and the inclusion of our animals and ourselves in therapeutic context, educational context, rehabilitation, and so on. And here we have cultural diversity, attitudes, opinions about animals, training availabilities, education availabilities, national regulation, existent or not existent, professionalizations, and so on. So what was the Ohio approach for this? To create a task force that is constantly working with the responsibility of clarifying the terminology, and to create together these guidelines and standards. And of course, they are being updated and continuously. And everything is based on ethical approaches, taking into account the well-being of animals and the humans involved. And Ohio encourages all the members or the future members or practitioners, educators, and researchers to adopt and implement these guidelines in theory, research, and practice. And here, just shortly, because I have only a short time, I just wanted, to give you the flavor of Ohio and the work of Ohio, and then you can go on to discover all the details. The main approach is this interdisciplinary one, which you all know it, one health, one welfare. And of course, the agency concept has been embedded now in all the documents of Ohio, and also the management of stress, the enrichment, and so on. So this approach, One Health and Welfare, it is recommended to be employed. I mean, here it's written should be employed from the initial planning stages of an intervention or session program throughout the life of each animal-assisted services. And these services should be performed only with the assistance of animals that are in good health, both physically and emotionally, and that enjoy this type of activities, enjoy. So here, we are touching all the concepts and the approaches that were discussed today. So it is mandatory that the handler must be familiar, knowledgeable about their animals, so know about the behavior of animals. Collaboration with veterinarians is essential. Veterinarians that also know about sentience, cognition, consciousness, agency in animals, and here we have such a group. So I will go further. I'm approaching the end of my presentation. Of course, I'm coming back to the 5 domain models of welfare that was addressed today in, I think, to nearly all the talks. We were referring to these domains, and I really loved the way Dr. Bloom has presented. And she made the statement that we are assuming when we discuss about the interaction with the animals, in this case, in the field of animal-assisted services, that the 3rd domains, nutrition, physical safety, physical environment, health, are being checked, fulfilled. And then it depends on us when we plan an animal-assisted service or services, how to touch the domain behavioral interactions in such a way to provide the animals with that safety, perceived or sense of safety, and the positive affective states, and all convert to overall welfare and well-being, and the lack of dysfunctional behaviors, and of course the installation of stress. So here is just an example, when we talk about enrichment, it was discussed today a lot. And I heard about the environmental enrichment. There are a lot of types of enrichments, isn't it? But animal-assisted services can be placed within this category. And when we, for example, do a visiting program with our dogs, to an elderly care houses, we are already planning an enrichment for the beneficiaries, for us, and for the dog. And we have in mind this definition that this environmental enrichment was never meant solely to provide animals with objects, to do something, to climb on something, but it refers, in the case of animal-assisted services, to stimuli or events that result in animals having opportunities to express their agency, to choose between positive alternative, to enrich the quality of their interactions with the physical environment, other animals, if it's the case, maybe not, and humans. So within the framework of One Health and One Welfare, we also have these 5 domains of welfare, of animal welfare, and we consider animal-assisted services as opportunities for enrichment for humans and animals. And with this, I want to thank you for this amazing meeting, amazing conference. We invite you to the conference in Amsterdam. I know that someone here is from Amsterdam, so I will be for sure in August in Amsterdam. And the next IHIO conference is called Wellbeing for All, Innovations and Insights in Human-Animal Interactions. Thank you. And also you are being greeted by my cat, Petruca, who just jumped around like 5 minutes ago. Thank you very much, and congratulations to all the participants, the organizers, and the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alina Rusu, for helping drive forward the mission of humane and ethical animal care. So we'll take a few questions regarding membership. I can see some participants saying they will be joining the IIO. So if you have any question regarding the IIO guidelines, kindly drop it in the chat box. But pending the time people drop their questions, we'll be taking pre-conferences questions. So Professor Alina Rusu, what are the common challenges related to animal-assisted services from the African cultural perspective? And also, what makes it difficult for people to embrace animal-assisted services and therapy? This is from Shidi Willie from Botswana.
If I may, I can give the stage to our colleague, Dr. Sunday Agbonika, because we just had like an individual interview with him, and he nicely put the challenges that he identified from these sides of being a representative for Africa. So Sunday, if you would like to give an example of the challenges that you consider that are important in the field.
Okay, thank you so much. So like maybe just to name a few of the things that I shared earlier with the IHIO board. So that's first of all, even starting with, for example, talking of as simple as saying the cultural and religious perspectives that tie with animal care and interactions with animals depending on the species. So that's one of the things that we talked about. And then another being the economic drivers of the this thing as well, of directly economic situation in parts of Africa. And then also going into talking about the fact that, so it also differs per place. So South Africa is a country that this has been going on for decades. We have people here on the call, Ronel, for example, who works with Pets as Therapy, who's one of the leaders of Pets as Therapy South Africa, that has been one of the foremost organizations that has been leading the charge already in this in South Africa, and a few others. But basically just encouraging anyone else who is interested and trying to see how to equally get to, let me use the language, interact with global organizations in the space, and equally look for how to work with globally accepted standards to probably consider IHIO membership, so as to be able to expand their reach, expand their knowledge, and equally work with the work within the guidelines that, do I say, put together this whole framework, which is one of the major places where IHIO really thrives, like having a major framework that is globally recognized and referenced.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sunday. We also have another question for Professor Alina. Do you feel that animal welfare is negatively affected if an animal is used for a public presentation? This being with the understanding that the animal has been trained and is comfortable with public presentations and freely chooses to leave their enclosure. This is from Sarah Miller from United States.
Excellent questions, and there are a lot of studies and meta-analysis on this. And therefore we have, as Professor Bloom put it, Dr. Bloom put it, you know, the leash sometimes can be seen as a secure, you know, not tool, but connection between us and the animals. So therefore we have to be very knowledgeable of the signs of how to recognize the signs of stress and to prevent the installation of stress in the animals that are public exposed. I'm assuming that you are referring to activities such as visiting programs probably, or I'm not sure, animals in exhibitions or animals visiting schools, probably. So this is, you know, an important training that we have to undergo to learn how to recognize and to prevent the stress installation in our animals, because we are the advocates for our animals. Thank you for the question. And I placed in the chat the link to the categories of memberships. We also have individual members, but also for organizations. And of course, you can always reach out to Dr. Sunday Agbonika. He's also always in contact with us. He's now in his role of regional representative for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Alina Rusu. So if you have any more questions on the IIO membership and guidelines, please kindly drop the questions on the chat. Please, Professor Alina Rusu, kindly help us check through the chat to respond to outstanding questions. Thank you so much, Prof. So next we move on to the last presentation. We're supposed to have a 5-minute presentation in French. And I would like to ask if the presenter is currently in the meeting before I call on the presenter. That is in person of the president of FATHER-C, Ime Adja CJ Annabelle Dennis from Cote d'Ivoire. If she's not in the meeting, that will mean we'll be moving on and we'll be concluding this conference. So moving on, we'll be going to the closing remark, which I'll be handing over to Dr. Sunday Agbonika. But before I do that, I want to thank all our speakers, Professor Alina Rusu, Irith Bloom, Dr. Meghann Dreschel, and each and every one of the speakers, and also the participants, and Dr. Nancy, and also the organizer, Dr. Sunday Agbonika, and also the organizing team for making today a success. And it is my pleasure to shortly invite Dr. Sunday Agbonika for his closing remarks. But shortly, there will be a brief photo session immediately after Dr. Sunday's closing remarks. Please kindly stay to the end and turn on your videos for the group photo. I welcome Dr. Sunday Agbonika for the closing remarks, sir. You're welcome, sir.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you, Funmi, for anchoring the session and doing an amazing job at it. Thank you to everyone who's been a part of the conference. I mean, like, it's so overwhelming and at the same time so joyful for us to see how year after year we are putting together these conferences and seeing the number of people that literally just show up and everything. Like I mentioned earlier, and we still had people signing up even while being on the conference. At the last check, there were already over 440 people that had signed up for the conference, and with literally from 47 different countries. So thank you so much. Like, it amazes us. Thank you so much. We're more than grateful. And thank you to our speakers who took the time to share from the wealth of their knowledge and everything with us. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure having you with us. And I equally want to make sure that we recognize and thank our volunteers. So we put out a call for volunteers after our Human-Animal Interactions Conference in August, and we had over 40 people raise interest in volunteering with us. We were able to select 26 of those. So we now have, I will call it a volunteer strength of 27 dedicated people. And thank you to Dr. Nancy Dreschel as well for being our, for also agreeing to be our volunteer advisor. It just enriches all of the work and everything that we're doing. So thank you so much for all of that. And I really want to make sure that we equally get to celebrate the most important person in the conference. And I would say the most important person in the conference is you, the participants. Thank you once more for not just signing up, but taking the time as well to be here for the live conference. Thank you. You make everything worth it. At this time, I will be shutting down the recording, but please just hang on a minute.